This story began on a clear, sunny day with a minor duel in the open air, the result of which was obvious even before it began. Despite this, the young ladies watched every move of the fighters with bated breath and sincerely worried about each of them. The Crown Prince, dressed in a white shirt, raised his sword and prepared for a new attack. His gaze was serious, and his movements showed experience and good preparation. His opponent in a red and black military uniform was determined, as this was an important fight for him, so he tried to give it his all. The boy raised his sword high and, with a cry, rushed to attack His Highness, hoping with this powerful blow to force his opponent to go into deep defense or even retreat. However, the prince was much faster. He jumped up and knocked the weapon out of his fighting partner's hands and then deftly landed on his feet behind his back. Everyone around started clapping for the winner, and the defeated guy sank down onto the sand and put his hands on the ground. He was very upset and depressed. The heir to the empire turned to his opponent and praised him for a good fight, and also added that he had become better at taking a punch, but noted that he had work to do, and the guy immediately agreed. Cotton Guido touched his red hair and thought that his battles as the main heir to the Myrta Empire were over for today, and he could have a good rest. His Highness's numerous admirers did not hide their delight at his quick and unconditional victory in this small competition. The girls began vying with each other to praise his appearance and call the Crown Prince a man of incredible beauty, speed, intelligence, and dexterity. Cotton tried to ignore the stream of flattering phrases, but simply stuck his sword into the sandy soil and stopped, waiting for a report from the adjutant who had approached. The assistant waited until his lordship wiped the sweat from his face, and then announced that he had brought important information that he must share with the heir. The young ladies present began to listen attentively and froze in place from what they learned. Moreover, Guido himself loudly shouted that he was not going to marry at 16. The heir was so outraged by this news that he did not even think about somehow hiding it from those around him, but only repeated in amazement that he had not thought about such an early marriage. The young man replied that his bride was of the same young age. However, the Crown Prince did not want to come to terms with this sudden idea that he would become a married man. The aristocrats could not believe their own ears. They began to discuss this news, which had so few details, and some simply froze in place from shock. The boy continued to protest, mentioning that he could not marry a girl whose face he had never seen in his life, to which the adjutant said that their first meeting was soon to take place. Among those gathered was a fair-haired girl named Adil, who did not whisper or speak to anyone, because for many years she had been sure that she would become Cotton's bride. Those around her looked at the former candidate for a wife and expressed different emotions. Some felt sorry for her, and some even giggled ironically, rejoicing at others' experiences and failures. It was painful for the girl to hear how they were discussing her behind her back, but she only clutched her dress with her hands and remained silent, while the ladies were meanwhile going through possible candidates for the role of the bride. With each passing minute, Edel became more and more angry and repeated to herself the same phrase that she and only she should be in the place of the Crown Prince's bride because her birthright status was very high. Cotton objected that he did not like the fair sex, whereupon the adjutant remarked that even if the heir preferred boys, marriage to a woman was his duty. Then the young man was surprised that the guy learned about his parents' consent to this union only now, and from him he thought that Guido had long been aware of the upcoming changes in his life. Cotton thought deeply, because for some unknown reason he had not been informed about the engagement, and it was very strange that his father and mother had done this in secret from their own son. The Crown Prince's adjutant, meanwhile, lowered his eyes. He felt sorry for the boy, whom his family had put in such an awkward situation by making a serious choice for him. But the young man was even more worried about the girl, because she had not even appeared in the life of the Crown Prince yet, and he already felt the deepest dislike for her. She would surely be upset. The heir to the empire of Myrta was himself quite handsome, and he had many admirers who dreamed that one day he would become their husband. In addition to his attractive appearance, the guy was an excellent user of cold weapons, was well-read and highly educated, which made him not only an enviable groom, but also a promising ruler. After thinking for a while, Cotton took a deep breath and said that since everything had already been decided for him, he saw no point in resisting his parents' will and agreed to marry. The young aristocrat looked closely at the young heir to the Myrta Empire and remained silent, thinking about how quickly the crown prince had come to terms with his fate, although he had initially been clearly against it. Guido then smirked and suggested that if he refused, the young man who had broken the news might get into trouble. The imperial servant did not respond to the crown prince's remark, but merely thought about how much trouble it would be to raise this man as the ruler of a large kingdom. The wheels of the carriage were turning quickly. It was racing at a decent speed, and soon the crew approached its destination. The royal castle was truly huge and magnificent, stunning any viewer with its confident beauty, the power of its high towers and the strength of its impregnable wide walls. There were two girls sitting in the carriage. They were discussing the upcoming engagement and the heir to the empire himself, because until now they had only heard about his outstanding abilities and appearance. The blonde maid named Rin, dressed in a red dress, looked around her new home with greed, while her mistress sat modestly and looked ahead, nervous about the upcoming events. Looking out the carriage window at the stone structures, the young noblewoman asked the maid to be calm and concentrate on the upcoming event, as she would certainly need her help. The future bride noted to herself that her new home really impresses the imagination with its decoration and beauty. After driving through numerous streets, the carriage entered the castle courtyard and slowly stopped in front of the main entrance. A young man in a ceremonial uniform approached the door and solemnly announced the arrival of the Princess of the Karn Empire, the heiress of the Montgomery family, Lady de Cartouche. It was Sir Charles, and he bowed politely and extended his hand to the young aristocrat to help her out of the carriage. The future mistress of the castle stepped onto the steps and looked carefully at the people who had come to greet her. The house servants lined up in two lines, bowed their heads respectfully, and began to greet Lady Ariana in unison. However, the very first step on the smooth stones almost cost the girl her reputation, because her heel treacherously slipped to the side, and she found herself on the verge of falling. Fortunately, Charles was still holding the guest's arm, so he easily prevented embarrassment and supported her at the right moment, allowing her to maintain her balance. The servants did not even notice this incident, because they were completely absorbed in contemplating the beauty of the young mistress. One of the maids stepped forward, bowed, and invited the guest to follow her, as she was to visit the throne room and greet the imperial family. The doors swung open, and a young man in a ceremonial uniform loudly announced that the bride's carriage had arrived at the castle. In the throne room, where the young lady was awaited, sat the emperor with his wife, and next to him stood the heir to the crown, the engagement to whom had already been agreed upon between the rulers of the kingdoms of Myrta and Karna. Cotton leaned towards his father and timidly asked what would happen if he suddenly didn't like his chosen one, to which the owner of the castle smiled and replied that the boy would definitely like her. And the king thought to himself that he was already tired of the pressure from the surrounding aristocrats, who reproached the ruler for the fact that his son was already 16 years old and he still had not concluded a profitable alliance. The emperor looked at the crown prince and thought that it would not hurt him to humbly thank his father instead of constantly showing his displeasure. But Cotton only thought that if the chosen one turned out to be stupid, naive, and full of flaws, then he would have a real chance to get rid of her, especially if she fell in love with him. A few minutes later, the doors opened again, and the butler introduced the castle's guest, Lady Ariana Montgomery de Cartouche. The entire throne room opened up before the eyes of the crown prince's future bride, at the end of which sat the emperor and empress. After a brief pause, as is customary in such solemn situations, the lady walked forward, straight towards the king. Armed guards stood along the edges of the carpet, and somewhere there, not far away, a young man could be seen who was to become her husband. Long chestnut hair fluttered during this procession, and the guards, with poorly concealed admiration, were surprised by the unprecedented feminine grace that appeared before them. Even the emperor himself opened his mouth in amazement when the girl came closer and appeared before him. She was so beautiful. Standing at a respectful distance, Lady Montgomery bowed her head and made a short speech of welcome, expressing her joy at meeting the imperial family. Finally, Cartouche straightened up, and Cotton was finally able to get a good look at her face and her large black eyes. The girl, in turn, began to examine the groom because she was seeing him for the first time. Guido looked closely at his future chosen one. He peered into her face, trying to find at least some flaw. Meanwhile, the ruler invited the girl to come closer. It seemed to him that her portrait, which he had seen earlier, was somewhat different from the original for the worse. Then the emperor turned to his son and asked him to introduce himself, since his bride was in front of him, but the boy only briefly stated his name. There was silence in the hall for a few seconds. The owner of the castle was still waiting for a more detailed greeting from the heir, but Cotton said nothing more. Finally, the owner of the castle could not stand it any longer and asked the crown prince if he wanted to add something to his name, but the young man answered in bewilderment that he did not understand what his father wanted from him. Then the king closed his eyes and coughed demonstratively in order to somehow soften the awkward situation. The daughter-in-law tried to get out of the awkward situation and, putting her hand to her chest, said that her name was Ariana. The guy looked at his chosen one with indifference and did not react at all as the rules of etiquette required when nobles exchange pleasantries. Instead, he only nodded. Everyone present in the room froze, because the dialogue had clearly reached a dead end from which the young people did not want to get out. Hoping to be saved, the emperor turned to the empress and made a pitiful expression on his face, which indicated that he expected a completely different conversation between the future spouses. The Queen Mother immediately came to the rescue and noticed that Lady Montgomery had traveled a considerable distance before reaching the castle, so a room was prepared for her where she could rest. De Cartouche thanked His Majesty for his hospitality and care and said that she was leaving the throne room. Thus, the audience with the Emperor, for which the young lady had prepared for so long, lasted less than 5 minutes, which was quite unexpected for everyone. Cotton chuckled and thought that it all looked rather stupid, if not funny. As the maid led Ariana through the long corridors of the palace to show her quarters, the crown prince reflected on how small she was and how defenseless she looked. The boy found this funny and imagined a strong wind rising and easily carrying Montgomery away from him. He perceived the young lady as a weak opponent, not a bride. Finally, the door closed behind the girl, and she was left alone in the large guest room of the palace, which now became her personal apartments. The first person the young aristocrat thought of was Crown Prince Cotton. He really was incredibly handsome and good-looking. At the same time, Guido's appearance shone with a cold beauty in which there was no warmth or kindness, and this was alarming. Then Ariana smirked and thought that she should think of her plan to break off this hateful union as soon as possible. At that very moment, the crown prince was busy resolving the same issue, because he had no intention of linking his life with Lady de Cartouche. And while this couple was trying to mentally separate, they could not even imagine what kind of adventures they would have together. Some time ago, when Montgomery first learned of her sudden engagement, she was so outraged that in a fit of anger she threw dishes around the room. The girl slammed her palm on the table and demanded an explanation from her father as to how he dared to arrange her marriage without her consent. The maid gave the master a handkerchief so that he could wipe the tea from his face, which had splashed when his daughter became angry, and the man remarked that she should humbly accept her fate. However, Ariana was not about to calm down. She said that the parent should immediately call a doctor because his mental abilities had deteriorated sharply. To this, the head of the Montgomery clan smiled and replied that her childish antics would lead to nothing, because all the formalities had already been observed, and the decision had not only been made, but was also technically ready. The young lady was shocked by this news. It turned out that preparations for the upcoming wedding had been going on behind her all this time, and it was already completed. The father presented his daughter with the fact that she could still spend this night at the family estate, but in the morning a carriage would be waiting for her, which would take the heiress to the castle of her future husband. This news shook the girl to the depths of her soul because she had planned to spend the next few years completely differently, and then suddenly her whole life took a sharp turn. With these heavy thoughts, Ariana woke up and sat up abruptly in bed. It even seemed to her that she screamed before waking up. Lady de Cartouche immediately began to reassure herself that it was only a nightmare from which she had finally woken up. The heiress of the Montgomery family leaned her hand on the bed and thought that everything was over, and now she could relax. Suddenly the girl heard a welcoming cry. She turned her head and saw 3 maids who wished the princess good morning, and noted that it was time to prepare for the celebration. Their presence could only mean one thing, that all this was real, and the realization of this fact sent Ariana into deep thought for a while. Lady de Cartouche took her chin in her fingers and thought that even if she was destined to get married, it did not mean that she would stay married for long. The girl smiled because a plan for how to get out of this situation came into her head. The heiress of the Montgomery family clenched her fist and prepared to go through the hated marriage ritual, only to get a divorce as soon as possible. Ariana remembered the image of the crown prince and decided that status did not matter at all if she had made a firm decision to be a free person. The girl chuckled at the thought of how her plan would work because Cotton was very handsome, which meant he must not be very smart, so she would manage to make him demand a divorce himself. The heiress de Cartouche was distracted from these thoughts by one of the maids, who asked permission to conduct a massage session. And when Lady Montgomery asked why this needed to be done, the servants replied that they wanted to prepare her for the gala celebration organized in her honor. Ariana was pleased to hear that she would be the main guest of the evening, but she asked what was included in the preparation besides the massage. What would happen next? One of the girls replied that this would be followed by a fragrant bath with essential oils, but the heiress de Cartouche remarked that she would like to have her breakfast first. The maid asked in surprise if she had understood correctly that the princess wanted to change her daily routine. Lady Montgomery repeated that she would be happy to have a massage, and then, before all the other procedures, she wanted a proper snack and did not understand how one could skip a meal. The maid smiled and closed her eyes, and then said that according to the schedule, the princess's breakfast was clean drinking water. Ariana thought she had misheard, but the maid was unwavering and determined to do everything as ordered without deviation. The other girls also unanimously confirmed what their partner said, that the morning diet of the future wife of the crown prince consists exclusively of water. After waiting a little and recovering from this thought, Lady Montgomery asked what was planned for dinner then, and the maid happily answered, "Water." De Cartouche smiled wryly and thought that this nightmare was becoming more and more vivid with each passing minute. Meanwhile, the maids began to fuss around her and massage her feet, while Ariana noted the fact that she was not a fairy who was content with morning dew. Then the maid switched to her hands, and Lady Montgomery smiled pleasantly and added that she was pleased to be mistaken for this magical creature, but that there was some mistake. De Cartouche put her hand to her chest and declared that she was born human and felt like a human, so without food she would get worse and might even die of hunger. However, the servants objected that the daily schedule was made solely for the purpose of caring for the beauty of the young princess, so she should be patient. Ariana thought for a moment and then replied that if you think of her as a fairy, then she is a magical creature and therefore can afford to consume any amount of food without harming her figure. But these words had no effect on the maid. Moreover, she directly said that she could not help in this situation. As the massage drew to a close, a maid named Signa was asked to ensure that the bathwater was ready and then to bring the princess her breakfast. Finishing kneading the skin and muscles of the young aristocrat, the servants repeated over and over again that in order to be beautiful, one must be able to wait patiently and control one's actions. Lady Montgomery smiled slyly and remarked that her beauty would outshine everyone present at the banquet, even if she appeared in only a nightgown. Ariana looked around at the furnishings, the large fireplace with candlesticks and the paintings on the walls, and then heard the maid suggest dressing to shine like a night star. But de Cartouche was upset by these words, because she wanted to be at home now, in a familiar and understandable environment, and not among all this high society and in the center of attention. When evening came, the lights were lit in the palace, and the musicians began to play their instruments, and then the formal part of the event began. In the great hall, everyone was talking about nothing but the princess who had arrived from the neighboring empire of Karna, who was soon to marry the crown prince of the empire of Myrta. Men and women of all ages and classes actively discussed rumors about Lady Montgomery's incredible beauty. But not everyone enjoyed such conversations. For example, Lady Fania Zelda literally cried her eyes out because she used to be considered the most beautiful aristocrat in Myrta. Fania could not calm down because all these years she considered herself the future bride of the crown prince. A little further away from the motley crowd, stood another aristocrat. She looked with irony at the hysteria of the young girl, realizing that the unfortunate woman was right at that moment destroying the reputation of her family. The noblewoman with the red fan was not going to give up so easily. She wanted to assess her competitor first. Men also discussed this union, but from the standpoint of benefit and influence, since marriages between aristocrats are concluded, first of all, to obtain additional opportunities and strengthen positions. Under the high vaults, endless debates took place on the topic of who would benefit more from this or that union. It came to gossip about the crown prince himself, and someone recalled his statement that he did not like women. Then some, putting a finger to their lips, recommended avoiding such topics. At one point, the master of ceremonies loudly and solemnly announced that Princess Ariana Montgomery de Karshut of the Karna Empire had arrived at the banquet, and everyone immediately turned to the doors. The lady appeared in public in a black and white dress and slowly entered the hall. Everyone gathered immediately began to carefully examine the future bride of the crown prince. The young men who were the first to see the main contender for the throne were so struck by her beauty that they even began to drop their glasses and fall into a stupor. As for the young ladies, they experienced similar strong feelings, but among them, tenderness and delight prevailed. However, some of the guests, upon seeing such beauty, experienced completely different feelings: anger, hatred, and deep hostility. Ariana walked through the hall with her head held high, catching admiring glances and listening to the hushed whispers of dozens of people praising her appearance. The young aristocrats agreed that even if the crown prince preferred boys, he would not be able to resist the beauty of Lady Montgomery. At the same time, Princess de Cartouche herself thought only about food because for several hours her stomach had been periodically rumbled, demanding at least some food from her hostess. In connection with this circumstance, the girl was extremely irritated by the fact that the crown prince had not yet arrived, although she had planned to appear after him. Sometime later, the arrival of the emperor, his wife, and their 2 children, the first and second princes, was announced. The 4 red-haired relatives slowly entered the hall and attracted the attention of the assembled aristocrats. Upon seeing the first heir, some of the noblewomen present immediately began to faint, struck by his beauty. Having drawn level with the hero of the occasion, Cotton glanced sideways at his former chosen one. There was no warmth or positivity in Ariana's gaze, only coldness and indifference. At this time, the emperor and empress ascended to their rightful places along the low steps covered with a red carpet. The ruler thanked those gathered, and smiling added that they most likely already knew the reason why he had gathered them here this evening. The Montgomery heiress looked at her future father-in-law and thought that he was very similar to her own father. Lady de Cartouche remembered her parent and thought that in front of everyone he tried to seem perfect, but she knew that in reality he was a very stupid and narrow-minded person. The ruler turned to Ariana and asked her to introduce herself to those around her, but the girl was only thinking about how to get home as soon as possible and laugh at her own father. Then the heiress of Montgomery and princess of the Karna Empire stepped forward and announced herself to high society, after which the emperor declared her the bride of Crown Prince Cotton Guido. This was followed by a long sentence about how Lady de Cartouche valued this opportunity and the right to become acquainted with the best representatives of the neighboring kingdom. Her gaze made the young people standing in the front row clutch their hearts. They literally lost consciousness under the influence of her enchanting eyes. Then the emperor took the floor and wished those gathered to celebrate such an important event for the 2 empires as the conclusion of a marriage union. After a brief pause and waiting for the guests to turn their attention to each other, the ruler poked his son in the side with his elbow and angrily whispered that he should invite the bride to dance. The crown prince feigned extreme displeasure, as if he had been forced to carry out a terrible and unpleasant task. The emperor narrowed his eyes and added that by making the Montgomery heiress wait in front of the entire society, he was disgracing his family. Cotton scratched his head and replied that he understood the importance of ritual, diplomatic politeness, and so on. Guido managed to easily find his chosen one in the motley crowd, so after thinking for a bit, he headed straight towards her. It is true that Lady de Cartouche was not thinking about dancing and high society at that moment. She was very hungry. The crown prince, approaching from the side of the throne, noticed with surprise that his future wife was incredibly pale, although she had not been like this the day before. Coming closer, Guido drew attention to himself and pointed his finger at the girl, asking whether she had been waiting for him or not. The next moment, a grimace of contempt and incomprehension appeared on Ariana's sweet face, and then she asked what His Highness meant. The guy smiled stupidly and replied that he was probably mistaken, after which he fell silent for a long time. The pause dragged on, and the Montgomery heiress turned away, then took a deep breath, showing that she was bored. Suddenly, Lady de Cartouche literally jumped up to the prince and asked how he was feeling, while the crown prince was clearly confused and asked the girl again what she meant by that. Ariana noted the fact that Cotton, with his whole appearance and even the tone of his voice, shows how unpleasant her company is to him. Perhaps he does not want this marriage at all. Then the Montgomery heiress added that the large number of aristocrats who constantly look at them and listen to their every word prevents the guy from expressing his true thoughts. The crown prince looked at his bride with his mouth slightly open and was surprised at how accurately she conveyed his inner state, his hidden anger and irritation. Lady de Cartouche noted that she understood Guido's feelings so well only because she herself had experienced it all. After which the girl moved so close to the groom that only he could hear her whisper, and then said that if two people in a marriage hate each other, then they should keep their distance. Then Ariana pulled back and added that since they had figured everything out, everyone could do their own thing away from their partner. Without giving the crown prince time to recover, the Montgomery heiress turned and walked away. Guido remained standing in the middle of the hall with his hand raised. He said nothing and did nothing to stop the bride, who was quickly moving away. Finally, Cotton was able to collect his thoughts and thought that he had clearly underestimated his partner because he expected a completely different communication. When the crown prince was finally able to fully concentrate on the new problem, he narrowed his eyes and realized that his original plan required serious changes. The heir to the empire remembered that Ariana had given him, at their first meeting, the impression of a weak, submissive, and defenseless girl who could be easily manipulated. Guido grabbed his head and sighed, then reminded himself that he had once again seen how deceiving appearances could be. Cotton smiled at the thought that perhaps he had found a worthy opponent, which meant that the destruction of their alliance would be more interesting than expected. Meanwhile, the princess walked through the entire hall and approached the door to the open terrace, but not just like that, but with a specific purpose. There, a faithful servant named Rin was waiting for her, who was supposed to help her mistress in one important and delicate matter. The maid was very glad to see her mistress and said that she was ready to carry out any of her orders. The Montgomery heiress did not hide her problem from the girl and told her that she was on the verge of fainting from hunger, so she simply had to eat something. The young lady told Rin to find an opportunity and get some food from the table during the celebration, to which the maid asked in surprise why the lady couldn't have a snack right in the hall. To this de Cartouche replied that despite all the beauty of the events taking place, a real battle was going on now, and she could not allow herself to demonstrate hunger since this would be perceived as weakness. The maid put her hand to her temple, as if she were saluting like a soldier, and replied that although she did not understand much, she would complete the task with all diligence and provide her mistress with food as quickly as possible. And indeed, when a tired and exhausted Ariana returned to the terrace a few hours later, a table awaited her, where all sorts of sweets from the imperial banquet were waiting. The Montgomery heiress began to devour the treats with gusto and praise Rin for a task well done. And then the maid asked if her mistress had managed to see her future husband. Looking up at the windows above, Rin noticed that all the maids she met in this house were in awe of Crown Prince Cotton's beauty, but only a few were able to talk to him. Then the girl was silent for a moment and added that Guido is admired not only by the fair sex, but he also has fans among the young knights. This news even made Ariana stop eating and think, and in the meantime the maid continued to bombard her mistress with questions about the prince, what kind of person he was, how he behaved, and so on. The Montgomery heiress raised her finger and began to talk about the crown prince. She began by saying that he was handsome as a prince from a fairy tale could be. Rin then asked if her mistress liked Cotton, to which she responded with a categorical refusal and even shook her head. The maid was very surprised by such a reaction and asked again how she could not like such a husband, but Ariana noted that they were not married yet. The maid surmised with horror that the crown prince could only make a negative impression in one case. He said something unpleasant to Lady de Cartouche. Suddenly the door behind the Montgomery heiress opened sharply, and a young male voice said that there really were unpleasant words, but it was their fiancé who spoke them. It was Guido. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked sternly at the girls. Apparently he was standing behind the door and listening attentively to their conversation. Rin was so shocked by this meeting that she opened her eyes and mouth wide in amazement. But her mistress remained unperturbed and only took another cookie from the stand. The maid began to mutter that the crown prince was much more handsome than she expected, and that she would remember this meeting for the rest of her days, to which Ariana remarked that there was nothing special about him. The heiress de Cartouche looked at the prince with displeasure and asked if he had really been following her. Cotton angrily declared that this was not so, but that the bride had simply taken his secret place, where he always hid from prying eyes when the bustle of the banquet began to weigh him down. Guido then added that he did not like the tone in which the princess allowed herself to speak to him. Ariana took another cake from the tray and coldly noted that he could behave similarly towards her and avoid boring, polite phrases. The crown prince smiled and replied that this suited him because he already had words he was ready to say. Suddenly, Rin became an unwitting witness to a verbal altercation between the groom and the bride when the guy called the girl a wolf in sheep's clothing, and she accused him of falling in love with her. Guido was outraged by such reproaches, especially because he did not have any positive feelings towards her. However, the Montgomery heiress seemed to have found a sore spot and continued to talk with a smile about how the prince's heart was broken when he first saw her. All this time the maid stood in close proximity to the prince and princess and listened to their harsh dialogue with undisguised surprise, and at some point she could not stand it and screamed. After this, Ariana and Guido turned their attention to the maid. They turned in her direction and looked intently at the girl. Lady de Cartouche immediately pounced on the crown prince with accusations that he had frightened her personal maid, and she deliberately called him cartoon instead of cotton, which enraged the guy. After listening to the crown prince's objections, Montgomery replied that his new nickname suited him very well because it was as funny as he was. Rin was horrified to hear how, in retaliation, the groom called the princess Blackie and added that her hair reminded him of a yard dog of the same color. Then the young people started shouting at each other, and Ariana even began to threaten the crown prince with physical violence and death. At some point, listening to this became unbearable even for the patient and submissive maid, and she, closing her eyes, began to squeal that she was asking the master and mistress to immediately stop the quarrel. Suddenly, Ariana changed her tone abruptly, turned to the maid and patted her on the shoulder, saying that she was done for today, and then began to worry that this scene had frightened Rin greatly. Cotton covered his face with his hand and remembered his father, who insisted that his son communicate with his bride. Guido then called out to the Montgomery heiress, calling her by her new invented nickname, Blackie, and the girl turned around. The guy managed to pull himself together, and now he looked at his future wife with a cold and calm gaze. Lady de Cartouche turned around irritably and asked sharply what else the crown prince wanted from her. Cotton answered the question with a question, asking if the girl could dance. Ariana smiled and asked her question, should she take these words as an invitation to dance? Guido's face became very serious and he paused for quite a long time before answering. The boy then made a special movement with his legs that aristocrats perform when giving a polite invitation. The crown prince then extended an open palm towards the Montgomery heiress, which could only mean one thing. Cotton observed all the rules of etiquette and, as befits an aristocrat of his rank, invited Lady de Cartouche to join him during the dance. Rin folded her hands in front of her and began babbling that his lordship was the real prince from the fairy tale novel she had just found herself in. Ariana was silent for a moment, looking at her fiancé's face, and then she exhaled with relief and laughed. The girl slapped the heir to the Mirth Empire hard on the shoulder and added with a smile that she had no idea that he could play a role so well, but this outraged Cotton because he was serious. Having finished laughing, the Montgomery aristocrat wiped away a tear and asked again if Guido really wanted to dance with her. In response, the crown prince made a sad face and glanced sideways at the door leading to the hall, and then added that if she did not want to dance with him, then she would have to go out and announce this to the guests. This argument made Ariana think. Of course, she was not happy with this whole situation with the marriage, but she had no desire to expose her father and her entire family to a diplomatic scandal. Lady de Cartouche peered out from behind the prince and looked with wide eyes into the open doorway. Directly opposite the exit to the terrace, the emperor sat on his throne, looking with hope and anxiety straight in the direction of the young couple who had started a squabble in the fresh air. At him for a moment longer. Her future father-in-law, and asked the groom if he was really trying so hard just to please his father? Cotton did not comment on this remark, but merely repeated his question. Was the princess coming to dance with him? Ariana quickly made a decision, clapped the prince on the shoulder again, and rushed back to the hall, where the celebration of the actual engagement of the representatives of the two empires was in full swing. Lady de Cartouche smiled and assured her partner that he would now experience all her boundless mastery of the art of dance. Guido chuckled at this boasting and replied that then they should start as soon as possible. The Montgomery heiress accepted the offered hand, and the two of them moved into the banquet hall. As they walked, Cotton noticed that the princess could speak, but as for dancing, he would now see it in practice. With these words, the couple moved straight into the noisy crowd, where numerous aristocrats and nobles who had come from distant corners of the empire were circling. One young lady, who noticed Guido and Ariana first, immediately screamed and drew the attention of those around to these young people. A few seconds later, everyone gathered was carefully looking at the bride and groom, who were slowly moving towards the center of the hall. The emperor even rose from his seat in joy that the children had finally begun to communicate with each other, and snapped his fingers, giving the command to begin playing a new melody. The musicians took a short break, and then began to play the next piece from the prepared repertoire. Coming to the center of the room, the couple performed the traditional ritual of bowing and making gestures of respect for their partner. In the movements of giving a hand, tilting the head and squatting, the young people showed everything that they had been taught in their families for several years. Everyone around froze and, as if spellbound, began to carefully watch the prince and princess, surprised at how beautifully they moved and how smoothly their movements were. During the dance, Ariana quietly addressed her partner, calling him by the made-up nickname Cartoon, and the guy prepared to repel a new attack on his pride. The Montgomery heiress, moving deftly in her slippers, said that she always agreed to dance with any gentleman, even if they were disgusting to her. Then Lady de Cartouche added that Guido would now find out why she did it, and immediately raised her leg high in another dance move. The crown prince asked what she had in mind, and then with a sharp movement he removed his foot, thereby saving his boot from a powerful blow from the heel of the princess's shoe. The girl was very surprised and disappointed that she had not managed to hurt her fiancé, and expressed her dissatisfaction out loud. Cotton chuckled and called the bride a madwoman who didn't understand what she was doing, and thought only of momentary stupidity and mischief. But Ariana laughed and said that she was a very persistent person by nature, so one failure would not affect anything. Following this, Lady Montgomery began to strike again during her dance movements, trying to hit the prince's toe with her heel. Guido carefully dodged all the attacks and asked why she was doing this, because the entire elite of the country was looking at them. The princess replied that from the outside it looked like just a minor mistake in the dance, and the crown prince should show his tact and pretend that he had not noticed anything. After this, Ariana turned her back to her groom in another dance move and said that she had to win this little fight, and began a new series of attacks. But the princess's shoes were not designed to withstand such strong heel strikes on the floor at different angles, so during the next lunge, the shoe broke into two parts with a crunch. And, having lost her support, the Montgomery heiress opened her eyes wide in horror and flew to the side. Cotton reacted very quickly, because he was used to fencing with swords, and knew how to sense the slightest movement of his opponent. Guido flashed his hand forward to catch his falling partner and save their reputation, and the crown prince succeeded, so that from the outside this whole scene seemed like just another beautiful movement, where the bride, in free fall, completely trusted the groom. One lady, who was closer than the others, noticed how the princess's heel gave way and cried out in surprise and delight, realizing how well Cotton had reacted. The guy hoped that after this incident, Ariana would stop doing such things and come to her senses. However, the girl continued to dance as if nothing had happened and smile happily. Moreover, the Montgomery heiress noted that she has such good control over her body that she does not need heels at all. The dance was coming to an end, and the couple began to make graceful final movements. It all ended with an elegant spread of arms, and for a moment there was silence in the room. And then thunderous applause came from all sides. The nobles clapped for the young couple and thanked them for demonstrating their mastery of the human body. Lady de Cartouche remarked that the prince should not be arrogant, since he was simply lucky, to which the guy replied that he literally saved her, no matter how hard she tried to deny it. Then the young people turned their backs to each other and went their separate ways, each remaining with their own opinion. Ariana stepped away from the noisy crowd to catch her breath and looked up at the high ceilings of the room, then thought about how she had wanted to piss off her fiancé, but instead had given him a small victory. The Montgomery heiress was very unhappy with herself, but decided that she would definitely not give up, and therefore she should find a new way to annoy the crown prince. But suddenly, a completely different idea came into Lady de Cartouche's head, that she should immediately break off the engagement and return home, while her rival was closely watching her. The stranger approached from behind and unceremoniously grabbed the princess by the hand, causing her extreme amazement. The blonde aristocrat immediately loosened her grip and introduced herself as Adilia von McNagan, and that she was very pleased to meet the princess of the Karna Empire. Ariana knew nothing about this girl, but from the quality of the perfume and the prefix von, she immediately understood that in front of her was a noblewoman from a family close to the imperial family, apparently the daughter of a duke. Lady de Cartouche smiled pleasantly and replied that she too was delighted by this new acquaintance. Adilia put her fan to her face and noticed that she had been watching the dance of the bride and groom very closely, and had to admit that the princess from the Karna Empire still had a lot to learn. The Montgomery heiress recalled the episode that had taken place in the banquet hall, and, to herself, noted how much her foot hurt, which was forced to lean on a shoe without a high heel. Lady de Cartouche did not respond to the noblewoman's attack, but simply said that she could not spare her time now and that they would talk some other time, and then turned and walked away. Von McNagan took this reaction as a personal insult, clutched her red fan tightly, and shouted after the bride that no one dared to ignore her. Ariana turned around on the go and asked the aristocrat what she meant by those words. But Adilia had already lost all patience and literally screamed at Ariana that she had forgotten her place. Montgomery's heiress was a master of dialogue and had iron self-control, and so she simply smiled in response to the rudeness and asked what the problem was. Von McNagan was furious. She replied that the princess should not be stuck up because she only danced with Cotton once, and when he left her, she would become a nobody, an empty space. Lady de Cartouche tried to find out the reason for the resentment that her new acquaintance was now showing, and she noted to herself that Adilia smelled more of alcohol than perfume. Finally, the blonde lost her temper and immediately laid out all her feelings, declaring that Guido would never love someone like Amelia and would always be passionate only for her. Ariana put her hand to her forehead. She understood that explaining anything to a drunk and in love person was simply pointless. The Montgomery heiress approached her rival with the intention of quickly and harshly putting her in her place. The princess asked how one could occupy such a high social status and be so stupid at the same time. And while von McNagan was recovering from this verbal attack, Lady de Cartouche added that even if the crown prince did not become her husband, she would not curry favor with such a naive simpleton. Ariana then added that no matter how her relationship with the heir to the Myrta Empire turned out, she would never humiliate herself in front of a worthless person like Adilia. And all because, and Lady de Cartouche placed special emphasis on this, she herself is the heir to the Empire of Karn, and a person with imperial blood should not bow down to the lower nobles. The Montgomery native then waved her hand, turned around and walked away, advising her rival to go home and get a good night's sleep instead of doing something stupid. Adilia suddenly noticed that there were random witnesses watching this scene, and this made her even more furious. The girl's face was distorted with anger, and in a fit of despair, she began to loudly stamp her feet on the floor. Von McNagan clutched her fan once again and resolutely followed the departing bride of the crown prince. However, suddenly, from the shadow of a nearby column, a polite male voice was heard, calling Lady Adilia by name and making her turn around. He was a pleasant-looking young man with a charming smile. He asked the girl to stay because he wanted to tell her something important. Having broken away from the pursuit of her annoying rival, Ariana went out onto the balcony, sat on the railing, and threw off her shoes, which had rubbed her feet badly. Only now was she able to rest a little. The peace did not last long. Soon someone knocked on the glass with their hand, attracting the princess's attention. Without looking at the interlocutor who had disturbed her peace, the heiress of the Karna Empire irritably asked what was required of her this time. Finally, Ariana turned around and prepared herself for another verbal altercation, because she was not going to give up her position. However, seeing who came out to her on the balcony, the princess immediately changed her tone and whispered in surprise that her remark was directed at a completely different person. An unknown young noblewoman with very sad eyes stood before the Montgomery heiress, asking for forgiveness for disturbing her privacy. Lady de Cartouche did not know what to expect from the stranger, and simply asked to what she owed this visit. But the girl was very shy and could not bring herself to start a dialogue. Then Ariana apologized for her haste and said that she mistook her for another person. Finally, the young aristocrat plucked up her courage, closed her eyes, and admitted that she considered the heiress of the Karna Empire to be very beautiful. These words made the princess smile and thank him for the compliment, and she noted to herself that this young girl reminded her of a naive pet. But the girl didn't come just like that. She wanted to know the secret of Lady de Cartouche's incredible beauty. Montgomery smiled at such a naive question, but replied that the recipe was very simple and that it would require finding an incredibly beautiful deity. Suddenly, Ariana's face changed and added that the found creature must be beaten and tortured until she begins to beg for mercy, and then the goddess should be ordered to give up her beauty in exchange for sparing her life. The princess put her hand to her chest and declared that this was the simplest and most effective way to acquire a beautiful appearance that she knew of. The fan was shocked by what she heard and stood with her mouth wide open, not even trying to answer. Then Ariana raised her finger and said that this was a terrible secret that should never be shared with anyone. The Montgomery heiress thought this was not enough, and she decided to enhance the effect by declaring that she and Prince Cotton had each found and beaten their own goddess, which is why they had acquired such beauty. The young lady stood and looked at the princess, not knowing how she should answer such speeches. Finally, the girl covered her mouth with her hand and began to giggle softly, and then thanked her ladyship for the lesson. Ariana smiled back and asked the girl's name, to which she apologized for not introducing herself right away and said that she was Lisandre Diaz, the daughter of a baron who owned a territory with a small village. The young girl began to list a set of facts concerning her father's holdings, mentioned the low crime rate, the kindness of the peasants' morals, but suddenly came to her senses and fell silent. The princess smiled indulgently and asked how old this innocent creature standing in front of her was. The question brought Lisandre back to reality, and she concentrated and answered that she was 15 years old. Then Ariana exclaimed that this was a wonderful age, and therefore she invited the teenager to become her younger sister and call each other by name, without regard to status. Lady Diaz immediately became embarrassed and replied that she could not do that, but the princess continued to insist and the girl took a step forward. The baron's daughter strained herself and tried to pronounce the name of the Montgomery heiress without mentioning her title. However, she failed, and Lisandre again said, Lady de Cartouche, which upset her even more. Ariana screamed with delight and immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Then she noted that she had never met such a sweet and gentle creature of noble blood with an excellent upbringing. The baron's heiress felt very awkward from such a flattering comment addressed to her, and she began to thank the princess. Suddenly, Lisandre noticed one detail that she had not noticed before, and immediately asked the Montgomery heiress about it. Lady Diaz pointed to a shoe that was missing a heel, and Ariana replied that she had lost it while dancing. De Cartouche jumped down from the wide railings that surrounded the terrace and added that she had just been thinking about how to resolve this issue as quickly as possible. The Montgomery heiress placed her hand on the broad stone surface of the parapet and announced that she had a plan. Meanwhile, Lisandre was thinking with admiration about how skilled Ariana was in dancing, since even a broken heel did not become an obstacle for her during her movements. The princess raised her second shoe high above her head and took careful aim. She then slammed the whole shoe down on the hard surface with all her might, causing the base of the heel to crack and send it flying off to the side. Quite pleased with her resourcefulness, Ariana put the identical shoes on her foot and noted that now she would be able to walk normally. The heiress of the Karna Empire picked up the broken heel from the floor and threw it from the balcony, noting that she would no longer need it. But the object was not destined to touch the ground, as it was deftly caught by someone's hand in a dark glove. Then a male voice called out to the princess, but not by name, but by the nickname Blackie, and the girl immediately shuddered and stopped. The crown prince squeezed the heel in his hand and asked why she was throwing heavy and sharp objects without even looking where they were flying. They could hurt someone? Ariana asked irritably why Cotton was following her and couldn't leave her alone, to which the guy replied that he was just walking and taking a break from unpleasant communication. The Montgomery heiress did not want to continue this dialogue and immediately turned away, adding that Guido could keep the find as a souvenir, but the prince did not like this idea. Suddenly the groom noticed an unfamiliar lady near his bride and asked who was standing in front of him and listening to their entire conversation. Lisandre tried to introduce herself, but her new older friend immediately covered her mouth with her hand. Ariana looked very menacing. She physically covered the teenager's face and told Cotton not to dare touch little Diaz. But the prince did not back down. He thought for a moment, and then noted that he had heard this name before, after which he asked Lisandre if they had met before. Guido raised his hand and continued his questioning, asking if the young lady had an older brother. Suddenly the girl broke free from the grip of her older friend and, folding her arms across her chest, asked if His Highness really knew her own brother. And then the puzzle came together in the crown prince's head, and he revealed that he knew Lucian Diaz very well, with whom he regularly held fencing training sessions, and now he had met his sister. Standing in the middle of green grass and dark leaves, Cotton said that he knew the guy only from the positive side and was sure that he would definitely become a valiant imperial knight. The princess even lowered her hand from such a stream of flattering words, and Guido continued to talk about the great potential of the young man and how he never stops at what he has achieved and moves on. The heiress of the Karna Empire expected to hear some joke or a sarcastic remark from the prince and was extremely surprised that the groom was capable of praising and even extolling someone. Cotton ended his short monologue by saying that Lisandre was very lucky to be born into a family with such an older brother. The Baron's daughter was simply in seventh heaven because her brother was praised not by an ordinary person, but by the heir to the Myrta Empire himself. However, this scene infuriated Ariana because now the sympathies of the young noblewoman from the Diaz family began to shift to the side of the crown prince, which was not part of her plans. Then Lady de Cartouche stood between her new friend and her fiancé and declared that Guido must leave their company immediately because he was preventing them from spending time together. Without waiting for Cotton's response, the Montgomery heiress put her hand on Lisandre's back and effectively led her off the court, adding that now no one would interfere with their fun. Heiress Diaz had very mixed feelings because she really wanted to talk to the crown prince, but she also couldn't refuse Ariana. At one point, Lisandre even tried to free herself from her older friend's grip. However, Lady de Cartouche proved very persistent, and Guido himself stood silently, not trying to tip the scales in his favor, so the Baron's daughter gave in to Amelia's pressure and returned to the hall. Cotton was once again a little puzzled by the strange and rude behavior of his bride, because she was being insolent to him no longer in private or in front of servants, but in front of other nobles. The banquet continued for a long time, until late at night, when, at the end of the celebration, small rockets with fireworks were launched into the sky above the mansion. A few days after the celebration at Duke McNagan's estate, an unpleasant conversation took place during breakfast. Having eaten a hearty meal and finished dessert, Adilia placed her cup on the saucer and turned to her friend. The dark-haired lady sitting next to her praised the aromatic tea, to which the hostess replied that tea at such a price simply could not smell bad. Then Harris McNagan recalled the recent imperial banquet and paid special attention to the princess of the Karna Empire. Adilia remembered her dialogue with Ariana and instantly became angry, and then said out loud that Lady de Cartouche was absolutely not suited to high society because she did not know how to behave decently. However, the girlfriends were surprised by such an assessment of the heiress of Montgomery and noted that, in their opinion, the behavior of the crown prince's bride was quite dignified. This reminder that Cotton officially belonged to another girl made Adilia literally boil with anger. But Von McNagan managed to pull herself together, looked at the windows under the ceiling, and decided to share the rumors she heard during the banquet. They were told to her by the same young man with the pleasant smile who had distracted her from Ariane. He reported that Lady de Cartouche had been expelled from her empire because she had prevented her brother from ascending the throne. Given this information, Adilia was convinced that she was a much more worthy candidate to become the crown prince's wife. Suddenly, one guest raised her hand and said that this problem in the person of the princess from Karna should be dealt with as soon as possible. Lady McNagan was delighted and surprised that she had managed to find an ally so quickly, and then asked how exactly they could get rid of Ariana. But the girl did not immediately tell her entire plan in detail, but only added that there was a sure and reliable means. Then the lady smiled, and Adilia realized that she wanted to tell her something important, which she did not want to say right away, but wanted to maintain some intrigue. The weather outside was clear, but in the mansion, Ariana was absorbed in thoughts about why her brilliant plan had not yet brought any results. The princess sat at her desk, drumming her fingers on the surface, trying to figure out what to do next. In her opinion, she did everything possible to properly turn the crown prince against her, and he should have been angry with her and cancelled their marriage union, but he did not do this. An idea came into the head of the Montgomery heiress on how to put even more pressure on the groom, and she immediately rushed to implement it. Ariana called Rin to her and asked her to deliver the letter to the address, to which the maid asked if she should deliver it to the same place as the previous one, to the daughter of Baron Diaz. Lady de Cartouche picked up the letter, turned it over in her fingers, and replied that the letter was not intended for Lisandre, but for another person. She added that this important note must fall into the hands of Crown Prince Cotton Guido, and therefore it should be taken to the chambers of the Emperor's son. A servant entered the chambers of the heir to the empire, and announced that he had brought correspondence for his lordship. The guy, without turning around, asked whether the courtiers had tried to independently resolve the issue presented in it. The assistant replied that such an attempt had been made, but the content of the letter required the personal participation of the crown prince. Guido reached for the letter lying on a silver tray and asked how things were with his opponents. Were they showing any activity? The adjutant reported that the ill-wishers were lying low. According to available information, the upcoming marriage was a hindrance to them, since it would strengthen the position of the imperial family. Cotton remarked that he had no more questions and that the assistant could go free, and then began to open the envelope. The envelope was sealed with Lady de Cartouche's personal seal, and this somewhat confused Guido because, knowing the girl's character, one could expect anything from her. The crown prince carefully removed the paper with the message from the envelope, fearing that there might be something sharp in it that could cut him. The letter began with words of greeting, in which the prince was called by the invented nickname of Cartoon, and thoughts were expressed about how unlucky the Montgomery heiress was that they met. Ariana then went on to praise those who once invented writing in mail, because she has the opportunity to communicate with someone she absolutely does not want to see. Then Lady de Cartouche began to praise the inventors of paper and to say that she loved the process of writing with a pen on a clean white sheet of paper. After this, the heiress of the Karna Empire began to reproach herself for using so many polite words, since the crown prince did not deserve them in any way. When Montgomery wrote this letter, she was indeed constantly distracted by minor topics and did not want to get straight to the point of her message. Finally, the princess was able to find the strength to put all her complaints on paper regarding the forced hunger strike on the day of the banquet, from which she almost died of hunger. Ariana then added that she would only be able to forgive her fiancé if he promised to never throw a banquet again. The heiress of the Karna Empire ended her message with a very strange warning that the crown prince should avoid any public events because they could cost him his life. And, as a postscript, Montgomery's heiress repeated what was said above, that any new banquet for Cotton would be tantamount to suicide. After finishing reading, Guido could not collect his thoughts, but now he at least understood why his assistant could not cope with this issue on his own, but showed the message to the master. After sitting in the chair for a couple of minutes, the crown prince suddenly burst into Homeric laughter. He came to the conclusion that this was all a stupid and inappropriate prank to knock him off his emotional balance. Putting his hand to his forehead, the heir to the Myrta Empire smiled and thought that such a bride would come up with all sorts of nonsense without measure, and therefore he would have to be careful and attentive with her. Sometime later, a maid delivered an unusual envelope to Ariana's office. Lady de Cartouche, who was lying on the sofa reading a book at the time, was very surprised that the message was brought by a house servant and not by her personal maid, Rin. To this, the girl replied that, according to the courier's instructions, the envelope should be delivered personally into the hands of the princess. The Montgomery heiress reached for the letter and asked what the price was for such personal delivery, and the maid replied that she received 20 silver coins for it. Ariana noted that this was a very generous payment, and added that the girl now provided herself with sweets for a whole week. The paper was beautifully decorated with wildflowers, and began with words of admiration for the beauty of the princess of the Karna Empire. After skimming the compliments in the first lines, Lady de Cartouche quickly crumpled the letter in her hand and began to wonder whether she should continue reading or burn it immediately. It was not an easy choice, and it took Ariana some time to make the final decision. Finally, the princess gritted her teeth and, overcoming her disgust, unfolded the crumpled paper because, having become the bride of the crown prince of the Myrta Empire, she entered a serious game where she had to be on her guard. Further in the lines, the unknown young man spoke about his feelings that arose after he first met Lady de Cartouche at a banquet in the imperial palace. In each new sentence, the unknown author described his admiration for Ariana's beauty. The Montgomery heiress was then compared to goddesses, sorceresses, and captivating enchantresses, each of whom was inferior to the princess in every way. The princess read this incredible confession, where she was equated with flowers, stars, and seasons, and at the very end, the author confessed his love to her at first sight and called himself Cotton Guido. Also, in this romantic letter, the crown prince suggested that Lady de Cartouche begin communicating with her even before the wedding, in order to get to know each other better and enjoy their leisure time together. In addition, the note included the address and time of the upcoming meeting, as well as a mention that the princess should come to this meeting alone, without an escort. At one point, Amelia imagined her fiancé, whom she called Cartoon, sitting at the table, sighing and writing this letter, but the image was very strange, alien, and implausible. The Montgomery heiress angrily threw the letter on the floor. She was still hesitant in her opinion that the author was either not a prince or it was still Guido, who decided to make fun of her. The princess had not felt such irritation for a long time, because if this message was written by Cotton, then he chose the path of sophisticated revenge. Then Lady de Cartouche picked up the note and crumpled the sheet of paper in her hand once more. In a fit of anger, the girl brought the crumpled letter to the burning candle with the obvious intention of destroying the paper in the hot flame of the candle. But suddenly her hand stopped on its own, because the message was really alarming. Maybe she should save it to figure it all out? The fact is that the letter described some details of their first meeting with the prince, but in reality everything was somewhat different. Amelia unfolded the message and reread some of its fragments, and indeed, they did not correspond to reality. The Montgomery heiress returned to the sofa and began tapping her finger on the table. She always thought better that way. Then she got up and decided that she had to take some steps since she was forced to play this big game of high society. Lady de Cartouche quickly dressed and left the mansion, telling her maid that she needed to go away for a while and refusing to be accompanied. Amelia replied that she would be fine, pulled on her red hood and got into the carriage, noting that her absence should not last long. Rin wished her hostess a successful and quick trip, and she herself began to think about whether she should inform Mr. Charles, the princess's bodyguard, about this event. While pondering what she should do, the maid went about her business. After some time, the girl entered the mistress's room to clean up and noticed a letter on the table that had not been there before. The curious maid read the message and came to the conclusion that her mistress had gone on a secret meeting with the crown prince. Rin laughed and began to reproach herself out loud for being too anxious, because if Amelia was next to her fiancé, then there was nothing to worry about. Suddenly the girl was called out to, and she turned around. Cotton was standing in front of her. He asked what she had just been talking to herself about. Noticing that the maid was looking at him strangely, Guido repeated his question. The maid was confused and replied that she did not expect to see the crown prince here, because he should have been in a completely different place at this very time. The crown prince was surprised by these words, and also inside him there appeared a very bad premonition of impending disaster. From the expression on the face of the heir to the Myrta Empire, Rin realized that he clearly did not understand what was being discussed, and then she became scared because the lady went to an unknown meeting all alone. The maid immediately handed Cotton the letter and added that the princess, after reading it, quickly got ready and left. Guido fixed a piercing and dissatisfied glance on his adjutant, who had just recently said that the opponents of the imperial family were lying low and not showing any activity. Then the crown prince coldly said that he had not sent any letter, and Rin covered her face with her hands in horror. Cotton asked how long ago the princess had left and whether she had taken a night bodyguard with her, to which the maid replied that some time ago the lady had got into the carriage alone. Guido grabbed his head because the situation looked quite difficult, if not critical. The next moment he quickly gave orders for the carriage to be immediately prepared for departure. Ariana got out of her transport and looked around. The place was unfamiliar. She had never been here before. Directly in front of her was a low two-story mansion, and despite the late hour, there were no lights in the windows. The heiress of the Karna Empire, covered in a red hooded cloak, stood for a while and looked at the building, not daring to enter. Judging by the external signs, columns at the entrance, and well-kept grounds, the owners were quite wealthy people, but no one was visible. Lady Montgomery walked slowly into the estate. Usually such large estates always had guards, but now the gates were completely empty. Ariana walked a little further, climbed the stairs, and found herself right in front of the building on a spacious platform. But the princess did not dare to go inside. She stopped in an open space and shouted that those who invited her here should come out themselves, otherwise she would turn around and go home. A few seconds later, the bushes began to move, and two young guys looking like thugs came out of them. They began to smile and say that the lady was very beautiful, just to their liking. Ariana was not at all surprised by such a meeting. On the contrary, she said that she expected something more, and not such a banal trap with street bandits. The strangers exchanged cheerful glances, giggled, and moved towards the girl, blocking her path of retreat. Some time ago, when Lady de Cartouche reread the letter, she came to the conclusion that the author of the letter wanted to lure her into a trap in order to do something bad to her. Apparently, the villains did not want to take risks, and therefore they organized not a team of professional mercenaries, but found some random guys who did not even suspect what kind of game they were entering into. Without even looking at her opponents, Ariana began to roll up her sleeves. She was already imagining what would happen next. The naive bandits began to mock the lady and make funny faces, saying that she shouldn't bother with her clothes for long, but rather take everything off completely. The Montgomery heiress looked at her enemies carefully, and she wondered if they even knew who was standing in front of them. Then an idea occurred to Lady de Cartouche, and she smiled at the thought that she could carry it out. With a sharp movement, Ariana threw back her hood and appeared before the strangers in all her glory. The princess smiled sweetly, anticipating the fun, and thought that she would not feel sorry for these two at all. Struck by the beauty of their victim, the robbers opened their eyes wide and their mouths open in delight and admiration. The Montgomery heiress's eyes flashed coldly, and she thought that in a situation like this, she might not be able to restrain herself and give free rein to her emotions. Making a sharp turn on the spot, Ariana quickly rushed towards her ill-wishers. Her movements were so sharp and fast that no one even noticed when the princess managed to take off her shoes as she ran along the cold slabs, her bare heels sparkling. The young bandits were clearly not prepared for such a turn of events, and so they froze in place and only passively watched the graceful and lightning-fast movements of their victim. The boys looked at Lady Montgomery as if they were spellbound, and it seemed to them as if the goddess herself had descended from heaven and was about to punish them, because for this purpose she swung the removed shoe. A hail of strong and painful blows fell upon the offenders, who were unable to do anything to resist such beauty and onslaught. As a result, one of the bandits fell to the floor, and the second managed to jump to the side, and he looked with horror at the girl, whom a minute ago he perceived only as easy prey. The princess then raised her foot, still wearing her boot, and took aim to deliver a crushing blow. The main target was the groin of the defeated enemy, who was still lying unconscious on the floor. At that moment, the thug who had managed to run away saw what was threatening his partner and began to beg Ariana for mercy. However, the girl smiled sweetly and with pleasure lowered her heavy heel right between the scoundrel's legs. The accomplice grabbed his head and screamed, imagining what would happen to his friend when he came to his senses. Montgomery's heiress took advantage of the enemy's confusion and quickly put on her shoes, then turned to the shocked thug, noting that it was now his turn. Finally, the bandit came to his senses and reached for the knife that had been hanging on his belt all this time. The robber held his weapon in front of him and shouted that he would now avenge his friend, whose name was Dalgan. However, instead of rushing into the attack, the guy began to slowly retreat back in the direction of the exit, and Ariana asked him where he was going. Then the bandit began to justify himself, saying that it was none of her business, and the girl smirked and said that everything was clear with him. The robber hesitated because on the one hand he was afraid, because his comrade had already been defeated, and on the other hand he was ashamed, because his opponent was a weak lady. The guy closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then exhaled and replied that he just wanted to enjoy his revenge properly. Without waiting for the enemy to gather his strength, Montgomery's heiress rushed into the attack with her bare hands, one of which was wrapped in a precious brooch. The princess looked the robber straight in the eyes, but he shouted that this look could only work on him once, and now he would not fall for this trick. Then Ariana kicked the guy in the leg with all her might, hitting him squarely on the toes. Then the girl raised her clenched fist, on which a tape with a heavy stone was tightly wound like a homemade knuckle duster, and added that she did not like to repeat the same technique twice. The blow was strong and unexpected, causing the robber to immediately lose consciousness and fall on his back, dropping the knife, which hit the hard tiles on the floor with a ringing sound. The princess looked around and shouted that she was disappointed with such a banal meeting, from which she expected much more. Then she asked the remaining opponents to leave. From behind the wide trunk of an old tree came a female voice that reproached Ariana for being a very cruel girl, which a person from an aristocratic family should not be. Montgomery's heiress replied that these words primarily referred to the conspirator who paid the robbers for the attack. The stranger stood behind the tree for some time, but soon decided to leave her shelter. With timid steps, the girl emerged from her hiding place, made her way through the bushes, and found herself on the platform, not far from the princess. And as she walked, Ariana tried to remember where she had seen her, because the figure seemed very familiar to her. There was a full moon in the sky, but the shadows from the trees still prevented us from seeing the stranger fully. For a while, the princess stood still while her opponent came closer and closer. At one point, the villainess came so close that Lady de Cartouche recognized her and was amazed, because she would never have thought that this girl was capable of such an act. It was the face of that same naive teenage girl, Lisandre Diaz, who had come during the banquet to find out the secret of Ariana's beauty, but now her gaze was stern and merciless. Not long before this, she came to visit the angry Lady Adilia and entered into a dialogue when she began to call the prince's bride bad words. It was the sister of Lucian, the crown prince's partner in sword training, who became the basis of the conspiracy for which the letter with the forged signature of Cotton Guido was written. According to the original plan, which the lady outlined while cutting the cherry pie with filling, the bandits were to cripple Lady de Cartouche so that she would become an invalid. The baron's daughter came to the conclusion that a bedridden, armless, legless, ugly aristocrat would never be able to claim marriage with the heir to the Myrtle Empire. And now the girls stood and looked at each other carefully, waiting to see what move their opponent would make next. Suddenly, Lady Diaz's expression changed dramatically, and she put on that same mask of a simple, naive girl that was so familiar to Ariana, and then she laughed. Only now it was some other kind of laughter, sinister and frightening. It did not cause joy but suspicion and fear, especially at night, when the face of the baron's daughter was illuminated by the moonlight. The Montgomery heiress folded her arms across her chest and asked the villainess how she managed to combine such different natures. Maybe it was a split personality and she was sick? But Lady Diaz continued to act innocent, smiled sweetly, and asked what the princess meant by that. Ariana replied that she was not sure if the person in front of her was the real Lisandre Diaz, because the younger sister of such a valiant swordsman like Lucian could not act like that. But the villainess continued to insist that she was a relative of the crown prince's training partner, and the princess threatened to beat her if she did not tell the truth. Despite the threats, the girl insisted that she was right, and Lady Montgomery doubted it, because she really could not now verify the truth of her words. Suddenly, Lisandre put her hand to her chest and said that Ariana was afraid to admit to herself that she had made a mistake in a person, trusted him, and received betrayal as a reward. The princess made a thoughtful face and asked if the girl was the eldest sister of the Diaz family, to which she answered in the affirmative. The next moment, the villainess covered her mouth with her hand, but it was too late. She let it slip that she was not Lucian's younger but older relative. Lady Montgomery made a terrible face and leaned forward. She said that now many things were falling into place, and the picture was beginning to become clearer. The girl gritted her teeth in anger because she had hoped to keep her identity a secret by exposing her younger sister to attack. The princess noted that even in the best families, real scoundrels and villains sometimes grow up, like her current opponent, to which she shouted that she wanted to put Ariana in her place. The Montgomery heiress noted that she had heard this phrase somewhere before about not knowing her place. An image of a drunken Lady Adilia, who had behaved very brazenly and provocatively at the banquet, immediately appeared in Ariana's mind, so she assumed that the villainess was acting on the orders of her rival. The princess then pointed to the house and asked who owned the property, because if it was Lady Adilia, she would get into serious trouble as a result of this incident. The elder sister tried to object, but Lady de Cartouche threw her cloak on the floor and said that their conversation was at an end. After which Ariana began to demonstratively roll up her sleeves and say that it was the bad girl's turn to get what she deserved. The Baron's daughter raised her hand in fear and began to ask for leniency. She suddenly clearly realized that she was about to be beaten, which she categorically disagreed with. The villainess said that she was an aristocrat from the ancient Diaz family, and in addition she was a lady, therefore she was untouchable, to which the princess replied that it did not matter. Then the fake Lisandre started talking about how much her little sister loved her and how she would cry and grieve if something happened to her. Ariana looked up at the dark night sky and laughed, then added that these pathetic attempts to avoid punishment were not capable of affecting anything. The Montgomery heiress came even closer and stopped. She thought for a second and said that all right, she would make an exception for little Lisandre because she liked her so much. Then the princess smiled and added that her punishment would be reduced to a simple but severe beating right here and now. And when a frightened and surprised Diaz asked what the mitigation of punishment consisted of, Ariana noted that the attempt on the life of a member of the imperial family was actually punishable by death. Lady de Cartouche's face became very serious, and she added that in such cases, by law, the heads were cut off not only of the culprit of the crime, but also of the members of his family. This news plunged the villainess into real horror, because she could not even imagine that this whole undertaking would turn out in such a way against her and the members of her family. Montgomery's heiress went on the offensive, saying that she would hit hard and painfully, but carefully. The eyes of the Baron's eldest daughter were wide open, and genuine fear could be seen in them, because the threat of ending her entire family was quite real. The Diaz heiress closed her eyes and began to look for justification for her actions, saying that she had no idea that everything would go so far. The very first blow threw the villainess to the nearest tree. From the strong push, she hit her back painfully on the rough bark. Ariana laughed and added that she would also show mercy and not touch the sweet face of the Baron's eldest daughter. Having pinned the girl against a tree, Lady de Cartouche began to hit her on the body, and she tried to resist and began to scream that the princess would become a real punishment for the crown prince. Hearing such words, the Montgomery heiress said that for such statements she would inflict additional blows. Finally, the Baron's eldest daughter could not stand the beatings and slowly slid down the tree, saying that she sincerely felt sorry for Prince Cotton, who was doomed to suffer with such a monster as Ariana. After such revelations, the princess even lost heart. Her face changed, and she said that the stupid villainess did not understand anything about her relationship with Guido. Lady de Cartouche continued to stand with a thoughtful expression on her face and repeat the crown prince's name. The elder sister Diaz burst into tears and demanded that the princess immediately shut up, because the privilege of calling the heir to the Myrta Empire only by his last name was granted only to her family. Hearing these words, Ariana immediately smiled and said Guido a few more times, and then thought that the guy's life was not easy, since he was surrounded by such people. The princess looked at her dejected opponent and asked if she didn't understand that her advances towards the crown prince were doomed to failure because she was becoming intrusive. Then, Lady de Cartouche looked around the building and said that if the Baron's daughter really wanted the best for Cotton, she would stop persecuting him. Suddenly, somewhere nearby, a quiet rustling sound was heard, which Ariana did not pay attention to, and it was a powerful magician casting an ominous spell. Dark magic enveloped the fallen bandit lying on the ground, causing his body to move and shake. At some point, the convulsions stopped and the hand, controlled by magic, began to make smoother movements. The Montgomery heiress was still smiling, but she already felt the threat hanging over her and therefore reacted instinctively. As soon as an alarming rustle was heard behind her, the princess leaned her hand on the floor and tensed up, preparing to jump. The next moment, a terrible blow fell upon the ground. It was so strong that the floor slabs cracked and fragments of stone flew in all directions. Thanks to excellent reflexes and good preparation, Ariana managed to do a forward somersault just before her opponent landed in the very spot where she had stood a second ago. Spinning in the air, the Montgomery heiress was very surprised by such unprecedented dexterity from a simple street robber whom she had recently laid out with the simplest of techniques. Having landed successfully on her feet, the girl began to quickly assess the changed situation. Lady de Cartouche looked closely at her opponent and noticed how much damage he had done to the floor covering. What was supposed to happen to the guy who lay defeated and suddenly stood up and broke through the stone slabs on the floor with his bare hands? The Baron's eldest daughter, who was sitting on the grass leaning against a tree, watched what was happening in horror. She was shocked by what she saw. Judging by her panicked reaction, Ariana concluded that the villainess was completely unaware of this new threat that had suddenly loomed over the princess. The robber's face was distorted by a grimace of pain and rage. He now hardly looked like a human being at all. The Montgomery heiress straightened up and looked at her new enemy. Now she clearly understood that a person with a magical gift had intervened in the matter. But there was no time to think for long. The bandit rushed to the attack and tried to hit the princess in the face with his fist. Using her agility and flexibility, Ariana managed to dodge, so that the hand with clenched fingers flew a few centimeters from her cheek. The thought flashed through Lady de Cartouche's mind that this man's behavior was not at all like that of the bewildered robber whom she had easily overpowered a few minutes ago. Meanwhile, the magician who cast this spell and turned the weak robber into a beast was surprised to note that the princess turned out to be much stronger than he expected because she was still alive. The sorcerer decided that he had enough of playing around and it was time to put an end to this duel because he had come here precisely for this purpose. Finding herself at some distance from the enemy, the Montgomery heiress began to catch her breath and think that dark control magic was involved here. Now Ariana realized that she had underestimated the enemy, who had decided to take precautions in advance and prepared a backup plan in case the bandits' first attack failed. The next moment, the princess heard the whistle of a dagger flying straight at her head. The Montgomery heiress was no longer able to dodge this throw. She closed her eyes, expecting a blow, but instead she heard a loud ringing sound, like that which happens during a sword fight. For the first few seconds, Lady de Cartouche did not even open her eyes, because the sound was so sharp and strong that it deafened her to some extent. When the ringing in her ears died down, Ariana carefully opened her eyes and was shocked by what she saw. It was Cotton, who deflected the flying dagger with the blade of his sword, managing to point it out a split second before it would have struck its target. The princess's eyes widened in realization that Guido had just saved her life with his skill. With one hand, the crown prince grabbed Lady de Cartouche and pressed her to himself, while with the other he covered them with his sharp blade, from which the thrown dagger bounced off. An angry growl was heard behind Cotton, as the enemy, enveloped in magical power, prepared for a new attack. However, Guido was an experienced fighter, accustomed to responding to threats from different directions, so he was constantly on edge, ready to repel an attack. The prince turned around just as the bandit ran up to him and struck the attacker with the hilt of his sword, causing the enemy to gasp and fall to the ground. Ariana watched what was happening with wide eyes. She couldn't even imagine that everything would turn out this way. Cotton exhaled and looked closely at his fallen opponent. Guido was still focused because the slightest mistake could cost his bride her life. After making sure that the danger had passed, the crown prince turned to the heiress of the Karna Empire and asked if everything was okay with her. The magician, sitting in ambush, watched what was happening with surprise. He did not expect that the prince himself would rush to help Ariana. Due to the situation changing dramatically, the sorcerer decided to retreat and tell his master everything as soon as possible, and while Cotton was trying to figure out the situation, the villain in the cloak had already managed to leave the scene of the battle. Guido's attention was drawn to his defeated opponent, who looked completely different from his partners in training fights. The bandit's arms, shoulders, and indeed his entire body were enveloped in bright clots of magical energy, which continued to flow around his clothes. The crown prince extended his hand to try to examine the magical effect cast on the bandit. Suddenly, a light hissing sound was heard, and the energy began to rapidly leave the immobilized bandit. This meant that the magician had recalled the spell in order to keep his identity a secret. Cotton winced at the idea of some scoundrel using dirty tricks during a fight. Then Guido turned around and repeated his question. Had Lady de Cartouche received any wounds? Ariana pounced on the crown prince, accusing him of pretending to be a prince on a white horse who is ready to rush anywhere. The heir to the Empire of Myrta winced at his bride's behavior, but noted that if she had the strength to be sarcastic and behave as rudely as usual, then everything was fine with her. Cotton then went to the girl and remarked that rushing headlong in response to a forged letter, and even without protection, was very stupid, but the princess objected that she was only pretending. Montgomery's heiress replied that the groom should not have followed her, much less entered into a duel. Guido couldn't stand it any longer and shouted that her childishness could have cost her her life, so she should stop doing such foolish things. The princess noticed that she had perfect control over the situation and was ready to fight, but her plans were ruined by an unknown magician who acted dishonestly. Cotton's face immediately changed at this confession, and then he asked if Lady de Cartouche could really sense magic. Ariana folded her arms across her chest and replied that it was only natural for her, and then added that Cartoon also seemed to have some abilities since he sensed the dark energy. Guido was still surprised by the news that his future wife possessed secret knowledge. Suddenly, the princess said that her whole calm and glorious life ended as soon as Cartoon appeared in it, the source of troubles and misfortunes. Montgomery's heiress added that Cotton, in her opinion, was a very weak prince, since his people could not prevent or even foresee such a development of events. Ariana then pointed her finger at Guido and said that he can't even control his fans who set up such dirty traps in the heat of love. The crown prince was surprised once again today and immediately turned his gaze to the girl sitting at the base of the tree. The baron's eldest daughter, without getting up from the ground, put her hand to her chest and smiled affectionately, greeting His Highness. Cotton looked at the girl in surprise and asked what Lucian's younger sister was doing here. The lady hesitated a little before answering. Apparently she was choosing her words, and then said that his lordship was mistaken. It was noticeable that the villainess was having difficulty speaking, but she gathered her courage and quietly said that she was not who the heir to the Myrta Empire took her for. Guido noticed that he was no longer understanding what was happening, because he remembered how they met at the ball and she introduced herself. Ariana was clearly unhappy with her future husband's behavior and suggested that Cartoon put on glasses so as not to look like a complete fool. Noticing that Cotton still didn't understand what was going on, the Montgomery heiress pointed her finger at the girl and loudly said that it wasn't Lisandre, but her older sister, who had gone crazy with her feelings. In response, the lady shouted that her name was Louisiana Diaz and she was the only one in the whole world who truly loved Crown Prince Cotton. Guido admitted that he was not prepared for such a turn of events, and the princess noted that this was only the tip of the iceberg of admirers that Cartoon, in his stupidity, prefers to ignore. The crown prince winced in annoyance and rubbed the bridge of his nose, then asked the lady what her plan was and why she had lured his future bride into a trap. Louisiana beamed with happiness at the fact that the crown prince of the Myrta Empire himself was now calling her by name, and replied that she had originally wanted to kidnap Lady de Cartouche. The villainess then revealed that she had dreamed of breaking Ariana's arms and legs, as well as some bones, so that she would become useless and clear the way to His Highness's heart. Guido asked again if he had understood her correctly that she wanted to cause Lady Montgomery multiple fractures, and Diaz answered in the affirmative, adding that this would have saved the prince from marriage. Then Louisiana noted that everyone around could see how disgusted Cotton was with this union of empires and how unbearable he found Lady de Cartouche's company, so she found a simple way out for the sake of the prince. The girl was very glad that she had managed to talk to His Highness and tell him her simple plan to free him from the bonds of his impending marriage. Cotton turned to Ariana and remarked that he didn't know what to do in this situation, to which she replied that it was none of his concern. After which, the Montgomery heiress began to roll up her sleeves and noted that she would solve this problem herself immediately. The princess added that she would now show the weak and spineless cartoon how to resolve issues of a forceful nature, and then moved towards the tree under which the Baron's eldest daughter was sitting. Lady de Cartouche smiled and said that she had managed to track down the real criminal and the customer, and that the prince was too naive and trusting to conduct any interrogations. Cotton watched in amazement as the heiress of the Karna Empire approached Louisiana to teach the villainess a good lesson. Suddenly, the Baron's daughter jumped up from her seat and began to shout that she did not understand why events were unfolding in this way. The prince and princess froze in place and looked at Louisiana in bewilderment, and then almost in unison asked what she meant. But Lady Diaz was not going to calm down. She continued to insist that all this was wrong and that it should not be like this, and then began to stamp her foot in a fit of hysterics. Ariana looked calmly at the girl and replied that everything was fine. They were just discussing how the Baron's daughter would now be punished. Louisiana looked at the princess in horror and then turned her gaze to the prince, and then asked him to refute Lady de Cartouche's words. Without waiting for an answer, the heiress of the Diaz family herself decided to tell the truth that his lordship hates his bride and avoids communicating with her in every possible way because he is in love with Louisiana. The princess shook her head and even began to clap. For a moment it seemed to her that she was in a theater and listening to the performance of a crazy but talented actress. Then the villainess began to talk about how the destinies of her and the heir to the empire, Myrta, were firmly connected by a red invisible thread that nothing could break. The Baron's daughter added that today, when the prince had come to save her from the rude and ill-mannered Lady de Cartouche, their red lines of life had become forever intertwined. After this revelation, Louisiana closed her eyes and said that now all the masks were off, and His Highness Cotton could boldly admit the strength of his feelings for her. After a pause, the villainess noted that the crown prince no longer had to hide from others, because the power of their love would overcome any obstacles in the way. Guido was in a state of shock all this time. Of course he knew that he had fans, but he could not even imagine that the situation with the mind of one of them had gone so far. Lady Diaz noticed that the crown prince was silent, and added that she was ready to do anything for him and in his honor, and these words immediately brought back memories for Cotton. A bloody candlestick in a woman's hand and a wooden parquet floor covered in scarlet stains of fresh blood. The prince stands in the middle of the room and looks at the little girl who has just committed a terrible crime. The young lady walks past him slowly for a while, but suddenly stops and slowly turns her head towards the boy. The girl's mouth opens and she says the same phrase that he heard just now, saying that all her actions are done only for the sake of the prince and in his honor. A few seconds later, Cotton returned from his memories, looked closely at Louisiana, and said that he had no idea that the heiress of Diaz was afflicted with a severe mental disorder. The villainess looked at the crown prince with astonished eyes, and could not understand why he so persistently continued to hide his feelings. Lady Diaz grabbed her head with her hands as if it was splitting with terrible pain, and began to scream that his lordship should behave differently. Cotton's surprise turned to irritation, and he moved towards his fan, intending to bring her to her senses. But Ariana blocked the groom's path and put her hand forward, which made the guy stop and look questioningly at the Montgomery heiress. The princess reproached the guy for not listening to her at all, because she had already said that she would deal with this problem on her own. Guido tried to clarify what exactly she was going to do, because he was worried about the consequences, but the girl resolutely headed towards Louisiana. Without waiting for an answer, the crown prince extended his hand to stop his future wife, but she deftly brushed him aside. Ariana raised her fist in the air, laughed, and replied that the most effective way to bring a person back to the real world from the fantasy world is to beat them up. Cotton tried to argue that this method is far from perfect because it has a lot of negative consequences. But the heiress of the Karna Empire no longer listened to the prince. She enthusiastically dealt blow after blow to the Baron's daughter. Guido was shocked to see his fiancée beating up another lady with her fists, while behind him one of the bandits, lying on the ground, began to moan and come to his senses. The crown prince scratched the back of his head and remembered Ariana's words about how she herself planned to deal with the attackers, and indeed it turned out that the princess was ready for battle. Cotton then looked at the windows of the mansion. Maybe there was someone there who would witness this massacre, but they were all dark and tightly closed with curtains. At this point, the Montgomery heiress paused to catch her breath, noting that she felt great because she loved beating up bad people. The princess then commanded Louisiana to kneel before her, and she obeyed the order without complaint. After this, Lady de Cartouche ordered the baron's eldest daughter to stand up, and the girl immediately complied with the order. Having played enough, Ariana gave her final orders for the villainess to go as far away as she could and never show up in her sight again. Cotton watched Louisiana walk away. She walked slowly, swaying from side to side, and her expression reflected complete resignation and emptiness. Guido approached the bride and noted that everything was done professionally, at the highest level, and the Montgomery heiress thanked Cotton for the praise. The crown prince looked at Ariana in surprise and asked if she was really going to just let the villain go, to which the girl replied that she wanted to save the lives of Lisandre and her family. Suddenly, Lady de Cartouche stopped shaking her hands and asked how the prince knew where she was. Cotton turned away and said he was passing by on business and suddenly heard a noise, and then he got curious, and here he was. As he walked away, Guido added that, apparently, higher powers were watching over the princess and taking care of her, but the girl noticed that his words sounded unconvincing. Then Ariana shouted after the departing crown prince that if he was telling the truth, then he should explain from whom he learned about the fake letter. The heir to the Empire of Myrta covered his face with his hand in annoyance that his deception had been so easily exposed. The princess looked at the night sky and added that, most likely, Cartoon came to her chambers, found out information from the maid, and then went here, to which Guido asked the girl to shut up. Lady de Cartouche continued to gloat as they left the grounds of the mansion, calling the prince shy and pointing out that he was blushing with shame. Continuing to cover his face with his hand, the crown prince finally couldn't take it anymore and said that saving Ariana was his mistake. Seeing that the boy had reached the limit, the Montgomery heiress promised to stop her bullying and asked where he had left his carriage, to which the angry prince remarked that his carriage was very fast, but only had one seat, so she would have to walk to the castle all night, and then the girl remembered that she had forgotten her red cape near the tree. The adjutant joyfully greeted his master. All this time he patiently waited at the entrance to the mansion. Cotton ordered the unconscious bandits to be arrested, and his sword and the princess's scarlet cloak to be found and returned, after which the assistant rushed to carry out the order. Pulling back the latch on the carriage, Guido asked how Ariana could tell that the girl was not Lisandre, since she looked so much like her. The princess leaned on the offered hand to climb onto the step and replied that she had some ability. Lady de Cartouche's face suddenly became serious, and she added that she was an excellent judge of people, or rather, of their inner world. Ariana remembered herself in early childhood when she first began to display this unusual gift. The little princess was surrounded by different people, some were kind and others were cruel, but she felt them from the inside and always knew whether the person was good inside or not. And this applied to everyone, both adults and children, just by looking at someone. The heiress of the Karna Empire immediately knew who was in front of her. After all, in order to feel someone else's inner world, a lady only needed to look into a person's eyes. After hearing this short confession, Cotton assumed that this was some kind of special feminine skill, to which Ariana replied that this ability has a very specific name, female intuition, and she has it especially well developed. Finding herself almost in the carriage itself, the girl said that she understood everything the moment she saw Cotton for the first time. At first, Guido did not answer this, but simply lowered his head and thought for a while. The heir to the Myrta Empire suddenly realized that everything his bride had told him was true. Then the crown prince looked straight into Ariana's eyes and asked what exactly she saw in him on the day they met. The Montgomery heiress laughed and replied that she had realized one simple truth, that it was not Cotton in front of her, but Cartoon. After which the princess settled comfortably on the soft seat, but Guido did not go inside. He got angry at such words and reminded her that this carriage was a single-seater. Ariana noted that he was talking nonsense again because there was so much space inside, but the crown prince was not going to give up so easily and repeated his words about there being no room for her here. After a short squabble, Cotton finally gave in and they went together, but as an excuse, the prince said that he considered the carriage a single-seater because no one else rode in it. Once home, safe in her own bed, the heiress of the Karna Empire could not sleep for a long time because she recalled the events of the previous evening and reproduced individual fragments in her memory. In addition to following simple instructions, Ariana conducted a short interrogation of Louisiana and found out that the mansion where she was lured was owned by acquaintances of Lady Adilia, a lover of alcohol. The Montgomery heiress twirled a lock of hair around her finger once again and thought about the fact that her rival, although a villain, had made sure that the evidence was only circumstantial, not direct. Lying in bed, the princess decided that she did not intend to harm Lisandre's family, and therefore would not publicly announce the events of this evening. But Lady de Cartouche had no intention of forgiving this attack, for which bandits had even been hired, villain and the customer of this crime at all costs. Then the girl's thoughts switched to another topic, because she did not go through this test alone. The Crown Prince played a decisive role in this adventure because without him, everything would have ended sadly, and she would not be lying in her bed now. The Montgomery heiress closed her eyes and imagined what would have happened to her if Cotton had not arrived in time. Guido acted boldly, decisively, and did not hesitate when it was necessary to defend and attack, so Ariana mentally thanked her savior. As she was falling asleep, the princess had the idea that she should write him another letter. Morning came, and the sun's rays, passing through the window, flooded Lady de Cartouche's entire room with bright light. However, the princess did not wake up of her own free will, but because she was woken up. This was an unpleasant fact, and the girl replied that she wanted to sleep a little more and asked not to be disturbed. But the maid replied that, unfortunately, her mistress did not have such an opportunity because a guest had come to see her and he was already waiting for a meeting. After some time, when Rin had put the princess in order, Ariana went out into the guest room and froze in place because Lisandre was sitting there. She did not expect to see her at all. The Montgomery heiress greeted her and asked what brought Lady Diaz to her house at such an early hour. The Baron's youngest daughter immediately jumped up from her seat and began to shower her with pleasantries, and then greeted him according to all the rules of etiquette. Lisandre lowered her head and was silent for a moment, and then began to apologize for what happened last night. The young lady covered her face with her hands and added that she knew about the mental state of her relative, and also that she was literally delirious with dreams and empty fantasies about His Serene Highness the Crown Prince. The Baron's daughter noted that she had learned of Louisiana's attempt to harm the princess, but Ariana laughed and interrupted the girl, saying that she was fine because she had won. Lisandre raised her face and began to cry loudly, repeating the name of the heiress of the Karna Empire, which Lady de Cartouche did not like at all, and she asked to stop the hysteria immediately. Ariana then smiled and added that she didn't get a single scratch, so her friend shouldn't worry so much. At these words, the Baron's youngest daughter began to sob even harder, saying through her tears that the princess was a noble lady, since after everything that had happened, she took pity on them and allowed them to escape execution. Lady de Cartouche tried to calm this emotional flow, but Lisandre could not calm down, but only stood and sobbed, saying new thanks for the fact that her family remained alive. Seeing that words were not working, the Montgomery heiress ordered Rin to bring hot tea and a sweet snack, after which the girls sat down on the sofa, and the Baron's youngest daughter began to fall silent. Ariana then became interested in the relationships in the Diaz family and asked if Louisiana had always acted this way. The younger sister replied with sadness in her voice that everything was different before, and they got along well with each other. When the girls were very little, they spent a lot of time together, playing and reading books. Thanks to their brother Lucien, who took the path of a knight of the empire, the sisters one day found themselves at a festive competition dedicated to the imperial hunt. However, in reality, the celebration turned out to be completely different from what the children expected, because they had to sit for hours and just wait for the next rider to return with the spoils, and they became bored. The elder sister was outraged by such a pointless activity and constantly complained and expressed indignation. At one point, Louisiana stood up from her seat and announced that she was going to leave the event right then and there, without waiting for it to end. And when Lisandre asked where her sister was going to go, she answered that she wanted to return home. The Baron's youngest daughter tried to object that her parents had sent the girls to support her brother on a hunt, and what would happen when he returned and none of his loved ones were around. The elder sister replied that she did not want to waste time on her brother, but they could find something more interesting to do right here without leaving the imperial festival. Lisandre was surprised and asked again what they could do during this time, except wait. Louisiana pointed at the trees around her and looked around the forest with curiosity, noting that they were going on a short trip through the local area. At first, the girls only went a short distance from the camp, but soon they got tired of walking around the same familiar places, and they began to go deeper and deeper into the forest. At some point, their adventures led to the little ladies finding themselves in a forest thicket where there were no familiar corners, and they did not know how to get back, which meant they got lost. Lisandre hid behind her sister in fear and said that she was very scared and wanted to go back to people. Louisiana didn't lose her composure, took her younger relative by the hand, and said that they just needed to move in the direction they came from. After walking just a little, the girls heard a strange noise coming from the dense thickets. Following this, the head of a wild boar suddenly appeared from the bushes, making terrible sounds and preparing to attack. The older sister rushed to the younger one, frozen with shock and horror, and tried to drag her into the forest, but she couldn't even move. At that moment, an archer nearby pulled the string of his bow properly and took aim. Louisiana, realizing that she could do nothing and realizing her own guilt for their forest adventures, covered her little sister with herself, expecting an imminent attack. The girls heard the beast running towards them squeal loudly, then stop making sounds. They waited for a while, but nothing happened. When the sisters finally turned around, they saw the carcass of a dead animal not far from them, with a sharp arrow sticking out of it. A white horse emerged from the nearby bushes, and an unfamiliar voice asked if the children were okay. The horse neighed, and the rider turned to the Baron's daughters and asked what they were doing in an area where hunting was actively taking place. The young man added that according to the tournament rules, people without weapons are prohibited from entering the territory with wild animals, and there is no need to even mention little ladies. Lisandre opened her mouth in amazement and began to look closely at the young man. She had definitely seen him somewhere, but she couldn't remember where. Louisiana couldn't move. She looked at their savior with wide eyes and couldn't come to her senses, shocked by this meeting. Suddenly, from somewhere outside, there was a strange noise and voices of people calling his lordship and asking if everything was all right with him. Lisandre immediately began to whisper to her older sister that they should run away from here as quickly as possible, because if they were caught by adults, the whole family would be in trouble. Before she finally disappeared from sight, little Lady Diaz looked at the young man, but he had no intention of pursuing them. The young man was looking the other way at that moment, so they managed to slip away practically unnoticed. The sisters ran through the forest very quickly. Now they were not afraid of animals, but were only afraid that adults could see them and punish them. Finally, the girls ran out into a familiar clearing and were very happy because this meant that very soon they would be safe. The Baron's children paused to catch their breath, and Lisandre remarked that she had only just realized that their savior was the true heir to the Myrtle Empire, and Louisiana replied that it was fate. The older sister had a very strange expression on her face, and she kept repeating the phrase that this meeting was not accidental. The younger Lady Diaz asked her relative in surprise, what did she mean by that? Louisiana smiled and replied that today's meeting could only prove one thing, that she and Prince Cotton were born into this world to become one. The Baron's eldest daughter smiled and added that their meeting was described in a fairy tale she had read about a prince on a white horse, so everything suggested that she was right. Lisandre tried to convince her sister that it was all an accident and that she was not a princess, but persuasion did not help. Moreover, upon returning home, Louisiana became a rabid fan of the Crown Prince. She caught the slightest news related to his lordship because she was convinced that he belonged to her, like a hero from a fairy tale. The younger sister hoped that over time, when her sister grew up a little, she would reconsider her attitude towards the prince, but this did not happen, and over the years her faith only strengthened. And now anyone who told the eldest daughter of the Diaz family that the crown prince was not a match for her became the girl's enemy, and this concerned everyone, even her family and friends. This behavior led to the Baron forbidding Louisiana to leave the estate and visit the capital under the guise of treatment and concern for his daughter's health, but Lisandre was able to move around without hindrance. At this point, Lady Diaz's story was interrupted and she sobbed pitifully from the emotions that had washed over her, while Ariana began to express her amazement at this story. The Montgomery heiress was also struck by the news that the prince, at such a young age, was already taking an active part in the difficult trials of the imperial hunt for wild animals. Then the princess returned to the dialogue and assured Lisandre that everything would be fine now, because she had properly explained to her older sister her protracted mistake. After this, the princess asked when the next hunting competition would start. Lady Diaz replied that there were only a couple of days left, and noted with surprise that she had been sure that the crown prince's fiancé was aware of this important event for the empire. Rin, who had come up at that moment, exclaimed that this was a very serious event, because they would choose not only the winner, but also the first lady of the hunt. Ariana looked up and asked incredulously, what kind of competition was this where a lady could win? And then Lisandre told that every year in the Empire of Myrta there are competitions among knights and aristocrats, where men hunt for prey and women for recognition. The best hunter, whose valor and performance surpasses others, will be personally awarded a valuable prize by the emperor, and the noblewoman must show wisdom and earn the respect of others, then she will be granted the title of First Lady of the Hunt and royal honors. Rin immediately threw up her hands in delight and said that this was such a wonderful opportunity to prove herself and earn the recognition of others. Ariana smiled slyly and remarked that this was wonderful news, from which she planned to make great use. The swordsman swung his sword to deliver a strong and powerful attack against his opponent. But the crown prince easily repelled the onslaught, despite the fact that the attacker even jumped up for a more destructive blow. Cotton parried the blows automatically, but at the same time he was thinking about something completely different, that the captured bandits did not possess magic at all and did not even remember what had happened to them. As for Baron Diaz's daughter, she also could not remember anything about the events of that evening, so the investigation temporarily reached a dead end because the witnesses questioned, deprived of their memory, could not help in any way. Meanwhile, Guido shouted at his partner that he was acting too predictably. The partner replied that he would try to improve, and the crown prince was already thinking about who could take control of so many people at once and control them like dolls. Lucian, meanwhile, prepared to parry the oncoming attack, taking a defensive stance and gripping the hilt of his long sword tightly. But a swift and powerful blow knocked the weapon out of the guy's hands. Then the crown prince added that all the defensive and offensive movements were written on the knight's face, which is why it was so easy to defeat him. Cotton continued to coach his defeated partner and tell him about the mistakes he made during the fight. Then the heir to the Myrta Empire returned to his thoughts and came to the conclusion that this was not ordinary magic, but real dark witchcraft. Therefore, someone dared to violate the existing ban and did so, understanding all the possible risks and consequences. The only serious lead in the case was Lady Adilia of the Duke of Macnagan's line, who had some connection to the mansion on whose grounds the attack had taken place. The prince turned his attention to his partner, who burst into tears from frustration at having lost the duel once again. Cotton's assistant consoled him, and Guido hastened to tell the boy that he was making progress. The heir to the Myrta Empire turned as a servant approached him with a tray and announced that he brought a message from Lady de Cartouche. The crown prince looked at the scroll with distrust. Lately, letters related to Ariana had brought him nothing but trouble. Finally, Cotton picked up the paper and with a quick movement of his hand unfolded the message right in front of him and then began to read. Guido tensed up inside, but the very first lines were not at all what he expected from the Montgomery heiress. Ariana wrote that she remembers what the crown prince did for her and feels she should speak out about it. The crown prince smiled and felt pleased at the fact that the princess had finally begun to communicate as befits a lady, without rudeness and caustic jokes. Evening had fallen on the Montgomery estate, and it was time for the long-awaited dinner where something delicious was supposed to be served. Ariana speared a berry with her fork and brought it up to her eyes, examining it carefully before putting it in her mouth. The girl swallowed the delicacy with undisguised pleasure and thought that she fully deserved it because today had been a difficult day. Soon a maid came and brought a letter from His Highness Crown Prince Cotton Guido. Rin suddenly looked at the message with anger and suggested burning the envelope immediately, fearing that it would contain another fake note, but Ariana replied that it should be read first. The princess unfolded the letter and began to read. She was somewhat surprised by the answer because she did not expect to receive one at all. In the letter, the prince called Lady de Cartouche by the fictitious nickname Blackie and said that she should not worry so much about what happened, especially not blush in front of everyone. Seeing her mistress's reaction, Rin immediately assumed that this was another fake to harm the princess. At the end of the message, Cotton suggested that the girl eat more fresh vegetables, as this helps with excessive emotionality. After reading these lines, Ariana crumpled the paper and ordered the letter to be burned. Montgomery's heiress put on a serious face and replied that the message was much worse than a forgery, so it should be burned twice. Rin put her hand to her head as if saluting and said that she would try to carry out her mistress's instructions. Suddenly, Ariana was overcome with anger, and she grabbed the first thing that came to hand, a pillow from the sofa. Raising the imaginary weapon high above her head, the girl swung with all her might and threw the soft projectile in a random direction, while she began to curse Guido with bad words. Meanwhile, a similar situation was happening in the mansion of Duke McNagan, only dishes, vases, pots, and everything that could break were flying onto the floor. Lady Adilia rushed around the room and could not calm down, furiously destroying everything in her path. Mirrors, paintings, books, and even the bedside table, everything experienced the fit of hysteria of the heiress of a noble family. But the girl was not alone in the room. She scolded her accomplice and called her rude words, saying that she had not coped with such an easy task. Louisiana watched this scene and repeated her words that she had failed. What upset Adilia most was that the Baron's daughter had failed despite the serious reinforcements that had been sent with her. But the elder Lady Diaz added that Ariana turned out to be much stronger than they thought because the princess can fight men on equal terms and is not afraid to raise her hand against a noblewoman. The Baron's daughter lowered her voice and added that she had now suffered the most terrible punishment, the Crown Prince's hatred instead of love, so she would no longer interfere with Lady de Cartouche. Then Louisiana remarked that if Adilia confessed everything, she could avoid punishment, but the Duke's daughter was furious at these words and began to shout that she could not be frightened by empty threats. To this stream of abuse, Lady Diaz calmly replied that she had nothing to fear anymore, since she had survived terrible beatings, and therefore only wanted to warn her friend about the impending danger. After the Baron's eldest daughter reminded Adilia that everything happened on the territory of the mansion connected to her, she began to hesitate and sank to the floor, in the middle of the broken room. The noblewoman clasped her head in her hands and began to repeat, like a spell, the phrase that she would continue the fight, regardless of the circumstances and the worthless people who surrounded her. The Duke's daughter didn't even notice how a young man approached her and gently took her hand, pointing to the cut. In a quiet but confident voice, Adelia's friend added that she should pull herself together and calm down. Then the aristocrat took a bottle with some herbs and began to drip from it onto the open wound on the noblewoman's hand, saying that he wanted to make sure that there was no scar left on the skin. After finishing treating the cut, the young man continued to calm Adilia down in every possible way. Then the Duke's daughter's acquaintance smiled and reminded her that an imperial hunt was to take place soon, where the First Lady would be chosen. The McNagan heiress immediately responded to these words, saying that this title should belong to her because she deserves it more than others. The girl clutched her red dress with her hand and added that no one dares to encroach on this title except her. Then Adelia's face became very serious, and she noticed that she was ready to take any risk and sacrifice for the sake of victory. Hearing these words, the young man smiled broadly. He liked the readiness of the McNagan heiress for new active actions. Then the guy added that he wanted to help the aristocrat achieve what she wanted, and therefore he had prepared a rare gift for her. The princess's apartment had an exit to its own balcony, which was accessed through transparent doors. Ariana got out of bed in the middle of the night and thought that endless massages and baths with rose petals are certainly nice, but if they don't give you food, you can die of hunger. In addition, due to the excess of heavy jewelry, the girl's neck and back ached, which she couldn't forget about for a minute. Suddenly, the world around seemed to hear her cries for help, and the wind opened the doors to the balcony a little in front of the Montgomery heiress. The princess felt a surge of freedom, and before her stood the opportunity to break out of this captivity and go to where there would be peace and plenty of food. She went out onto the balcony and put her foot on the parapet. Ariana thought that she would have time to rest and improve her health with abundant food before the start of the imperial hunt, because the maids would always help her. The maids were already waiting for their mistress, right under the balcony. They held the edges of their dresses with their hands and respectfully greeted their mistress. Lady de Cartouche was pleased that the servants shared her impulse and were ready to support her in difficult times. One of the maids suggested that the princess was so perfect that she didn't even need to sleep at night. But other girls rejected this assumption, noting that sleep improves the condition of the skin and therefore is an essential means of rejuvenation. Eventually, the servants came to the conclusion that their main concern was to help Lady de Cartouche take her place of honor as First Lady of the Hunt. The Montgomery heiress was very glad to hear that such care was being taken of her, but she thought to herself that during her nightly adventures the previous day, she had had an opportunity to escape, but she had missed it. For some time, the two maids argued about which piece of jewelry would be more suitable for the heir to the Karna Empire. Others were putting on makeup and expensive bracelets at the same time, and everyone was very engrossed in the process and asked Ariana to wrinkle her forehead as little as possible. But at some point, hunger and fatigue prevailed, and the Montgomery heiress began to cry, remembering how good and well-fed she felt in her home. One of the maids began to ponder out loud what kind of dress would best suit the princess, to which the lady replied in despair that she would agree to the first one that came her way. To which the girl immediately protested, declaring that the heiress of the Karna Empire could only appear in high society in the dress in which she would shine brighter than anyone else. Rin then pointed to the clothes rack and asked what outfit she should get for Lady de Cartouche, to which the princess replied that she wanted to wear the dress hanging to the left of the others. But the maid was not satisfied with this answer, and she asked the lady to at least look at the wardrobe. Then Ariana reluctantly turned her head and began to choose. After thinking for a moment, the aristocrat pointed her finger at a dress with a long blue belt. Then the heiress of the Karna Empire added that she wanted to wear this outfit made of translucent fabric on top, and as a base, underneath she wants to use this long mother-of-pearl dress. Afterwards, Ariana gave a thumbs up and noted that this is her final wardrobe decision, so she wants to get dressed in it as soon as possible. Rin began to think out loud about what kind of jewelry would be best suited to hide the exposed parts of her mistress's body, but then Lady de Cartouche turned to her maid and asked why she was hesitating instead of simply carrying out the order. The maid raised her fists and replied that she wanted to think through every detail of the outfit, including jewelry, so that her mistress would look dazzling. The Montgomery heiress smiled and said that the girl shouldn't try so hard, but Rin couldn't be stopped and declared that she would make a dress worthy of a fairy. The preparations were long and meticulous. All the maids tried very hard to give their mistress the most attractive appearance possible and used a lot of tools for this. At the very end, the princess's hair was decorated with a beautiful hair clip in the shape of a large blue butterfly. The maids were very pleased with the result and watched with delight as the final touches were given to the image. Despite the joy of the maids, Ariana's face expressed sadness and melancholy because she paid for this beauty with hunger and all kinds of deprivation. Then the princess smiled and added that she did not understand this jubilation because she was so beautiful every day and not just today. Rin dreamily closed her eyes and noticed that Prince Guido would once again be struck dead by the sight of this unprecedented beauty. Lady de Cartouche made a terrible face and tried to assure those around her that all these preparations were not for cotton at all, but for high society. Then the Montgomery heiress raised her hand and pointed out the fact that the crown prince did not care about a person's appearance, otherwise he would not be able to move away from the mirror. After that, the princess announced that it was time for her to leave and headed towards the exit, but Rin asked in surprise if the lady was really going to leave the mansion without an escort. The other maids were also confused. They thought that the heiress of the Karna Empire would wait for cotton, and then they would go together, but Ariana replied that she would travel alone just fine. Pausing at the door, Lady de Cartouche noted that she herself had asked the prince not to come for her. At this very time, in the imperial castle, Cotton had completed his preparations for the hunt and was ready to set out. Guido pulled a white glove onto his hand and turned to his assistant, saying that they should leave now. In response to this, the young man offered to go ahead at once to warn Lady de Cartouche that the prince would soon call for her. To this, Cotton replied that there was no need, since he had not planned to accompany Ariana, but had immediately planned to go to the hunting competition site. At that moment, the prince remembered the lines from the letter of the heiress of Montgomery, where she promised to beat the groom if he decided to come to accompany her. Guido turned around at the assistant's question and informed him that Lady de Cartouche herself did not wish to be accompanied by anyone on her trip to the event. The servant looked after his departing master and noticed that the prince was depriving himself of a rare opportunity to be the first among other nobles to behold the beauty of the heiress of the Karna Empire. And as the young people walked down the corridor, the adjutant talked about the strong impression Ariana had made at the engagement banquet, to which the crown prince replied that people had problems with their eyesight. But the adjutant could not calm down and continued to argue, and then said that this was all because His Highness divided people into only two classes, with which the crown prince categorically disagreed. Then the guy stopped and added that, indeed, within these two sorts there is also a classification of higher and lower characters, but this does not change the overall picture. Cotton turned away and walked further down the corridor, noticing that the assistant did not know him at all, but he did not calm down and said that he had served the crown prince for many years and therefore knew him well. Guido replied without turning around that the guy could lose this position at any moment, but the adjutant only smiled, thinking that he would definitely leave this post someday, but not today. The weather outside was clear, and the royal tents were located right under the open sky. The empress tapped her finger in a long black glove on the armrest of her throne and said that she did not like the place that had been chosen for the competition because it seemed dangerous to her. The emperor responded with surprise that he had raised his son to be strong, and therefore these conditions should be acceptable to him, to which the queen retorted that she alone was involved in raising the heir. The master of the Myrta Empire immediately fell silent. He felt awkward because he really hadn't spent much time with the crown prince. Suddenly, the noise of an approaching carriage was heard outside the tent, and all the guests turned in that direction, and then moved to meet the important person. The carriage, drawn by white horses, stopped, and a knight ran up to it, opened the door, and offered his hand to help the lady safely get off the ground. Those around her watched with bated breath every step of Her Highness, who slowly placed her shoe on the footstool. Then Ariana leaned on the hand offered to her, fixed her hair, and smiled sweetly at everyone. The reaction of those around was similar to what the Montgomery heiress had already seen at the ball in honor of her engagement. Girls were speechless, and guys fainted, struck by the beauty of the bride. Cotton's adjutant was also struck by Ariana's beauty and noted to himself that the hunt had not yet begun, and many had already suffered serious harm to their health. Guido smiled widely and greeted the heiress of the Karna Empire at the opening of the royal hunting competition. Lady de Cartouche responded with the same friendly expression and remarked that she was very glad to see her fiancé in good health, while she herself thought how unpleasant it was for her to see Guido. The emperor was happy to see the young people communicating kindly and pleasantly, although he did not hear how they whispered their dissatisfaction to each other. Cotton whispered that if Chernish wanted to make a scene, she shouldn't hold back, and the girl replied that Cartuna shouldn't tell her what to do, and anyway, there was no point in talking to her. Despite their welcoming smiles, the bride and groom found it extremely difficult to endure joint events, but their status and the opinions of others forced them to keep themselves within limits. Ariana caught the crown prince's attention and asked him what he thought of her new dress. The Montgomery heiress then lifted the edge of the garment and showed Guido how easily the light fabric fluttered as he moved. Cotton was a little embarrassed and said that he did not understand why Lady de Cartouche was wearing such an unusual outfit. For a moment the crown prince stood and looked at the hem of the dress, wondering what his bride was up to this time. What should he be afraid of? Then the guy decided to speak out on this matter and added that it was probably extremely uncomfortable to sit and walk in such an outfit, to which Ariana only smiled. The king watched his son and daughter-in-law closely and was very pleased with the fact that they began to communicate and even joke with each other. After waiting for a moment, the emperor stood up, coughed, and asked for a moment of attention. The ruler spread his arms wide and thanked those gathered for deciding to take part in the tournament, and also added that, according to his information, the golden boar was hiding somewhere in the forest. The crowd of participants immediately began to mutter about how this legendary beast was of enormous size and strength, and in general, it was more often seen in the book than in reality. The emperor waited until the conversation died down and continued, telling that he wanted to see the golden tail of this monster, so the winner would be the one who defeated the strange beast. After this, the king added that the status of First Lady of the Hunt would be given to the noblewoman who would be kissed by the winner of the competition, and all the aristocrats began to animatedly discuss this news. Then a servant came forward and announced that all knights should prepare for the start of the royal hunting tournament. The ladies tried in every way to motivate and set their gentlemen up for success because the couple received a double prize, an award from the hands of the emperor for the man and the status of First Lady of the Hunt for the winner's girlfriend. Ariana turned to her maid and said that she had once read in a book about this golden boar, and it was really huge. Rin smiled and asked if the lady really believed that the beast was as big as they wrote in the fairy tales, to which the princess replied that she would only say for sure when she saw it in person. Suddenly the maid saw that her mistress was doing some strange manipulations with her hair, and she asked what was going on. The princess smiled cheerfully and adjusted her wig on her head, and then asked the maid if she wanted to see the tail of this terrible beast before it fell into the hands of Emperor Murta. Rin and the young man from the retinue stared with wide eyes at the transformation of Lady de Cartouche. They were so shocked by what they saw that they seemed to be speechless. Finally, the guy got a grip on his emotions and was able to exclaim that this simply couldn't be. But the Montgomery heiress could not answer him, because she was no longer in the tent, and this greatly agitated the bystanders, since a fair-haired guy was sitting on the princess's chair. The unfamiliar young man with Ariana's eyes winked cheerfully and said that sometimes even impossible things happen. On the lawn outside the imperial tents, young ladies, acquaintances of the heiress of Duke McNagan, gathered to discuss current news and the royal hunt. People around her praised their friend Adilia's new hair accessory and said that it suits her very well. The duke's daughter replied that it was indeed an unusual hairpin, as it was made to special order in a single copy. Then the girl put a cup of aromatic tea on a saucer and added that she was very glad to see familiar faces, because they would witness her imminent triumph. After that, Adilia took out an unusual brooch that shimmered from the inside and noted that today would be a special day for everyone. Lisandre took Louisiana's hand and pulled her insistently because she wanted them to share the joy of communicating with the princess. The persistent younger sister was very eager to find Lady de Cartouche to express her warmest feelings to her personally and welcome her to the royal hunting competition. But the young noblewoman could not find Ariana, although she had already looked into every tent, and she knew for sure that the crown prince's bride had arrived at the event an hour earlier. As a result, the aristocrat came to the conclusion that the heiress of the Karna Empire, if not on the territory somewhere nearby, then went somewhere, perhaps even deep into the forest, where hunting takes place. After wandering around the camp a little more and once again checking all the places where the princess could be, the girls approached the edge of the safe territory and stopped. Their search had definitely reached a dead end. The young noblewomen did not know what to do and silently looked at each other, hoping that someone would offer the right solution. The girls looked with some fear in the direction of the dense green forest, where at that moment the competition had already begun, and hunters from all over the empire were actively searching for the main prey. The adjutant accompanying the crown prince expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that His Highness was clearly not eager to get the main prize and was not looking for the beast at all. Cotton did act a little strange for a hunter. He lay down on his horse, letting it choose the path on its own, and he himself did nothing at that time, only looked at the trees. Guido replied that with such words the assistant was only insulting the king's horse, whom he trusted completely, but the boy continued to insist that they should hurry. The heir to the Empire of Myrta noticed that the adjutant did not understand anything about this trip, and therefore should not interfere with him admiring the trees, bushes, and local vegetation, including mushrooms. However, Giron continued to insist on his position. He drew level with the master's horse and asked why the crown prince did not want to hunt. Then Cotton threw his head up and groaned that he felt sick. Guido's face twisted in disgust, and he said that it wasn't the event itself that angered him, but the award that the winner was to present to the First Lady of the Hunt. After all, if he wins the competition to catch the beast, then the father emperor will insist that his son give a kiss to his bride, and he is disgusted by even the thought of touching her. Sir Tiraman closed his eyes and noted that he simply loved hunting and wanted to see how the crown prince hunted. Then Cotton asked why the adjutant himself did not go hunting. Suddenly the young men heard the sound of tramping, and the adjutant pointed his hand at a deer that quickly ran out of the forest thicket, but right before their eyes, someone's well-aimed arrow caught the animal. Only a professional hunter can hit a moving target with an arrow, and the prince and his assistant were very surprised to see such a high level of skill in practice. Guido laughed, saying that Giron was so good at hunting that he could shoot a wild animal with his finger. Then the crown prince began to look for the shooter, and soon a young, unfamiliar nobleman with blonde hair and his henchmen appeared from the bushes. The archer glanced at the young men sitting on horses and who had become accidental witnesses of his prey. But as soon as their gazes met, the stranger froze in place for a moment. Cotton looked into those large, dark eyes, and they seemed very familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where he had seen their owner. The next moment, the unknown hunter turned sharply on the spot and, ordering his partner to follow him, took off running. Tiraman watched the fugitive with surprise and noted the fact that no one had ever run away from a meeting with the heir to the Myrta Empire so quickly, abandoning their prey. Guido put his hand to his chin and thought deeply. This was all really very strange. With each passing second, the fugitives moved further and further away from the meeting place with the crown prince, with the hunter running first and the servant barely keeping up. At some point, the assistant could not stand it any longer and stopped. He was very tired and asked Sir Thomas to take a rest because there was no pursuit after them. The young archer turned around and began to peer carefully between the trees. Finally, he was convinced that they were not being pursued and allowed himself to relax a little. Ariana put her hand to her chest and said that she really didn't want Sir Thomas, who she pretended to be caught by someone she knew. Finally, the guide caught his breath and said that he thought this was all wrong and therefore he wanted to go back to camp. The princess exclaimed in surprise that they couldn't give up at the very beginning of the journey because they couldn't even find the golden boar. The bodyguard replied that these disguises and fixation on the trophy would lead to trouble, and besides, he did not understand how, in case of victory, the first lady of the hunt would be appointed. Lady de Cartouche noted that she wanted to choose the first lady herself, and also to damage the crown prince's pride, because everyone expects him to win, and she will take it for herself. The Montgomery heiress rubbed her chin and dreamily suggested that Cotton would be very angry when he learned that he had been beaten in this jousting competition by a lady. In addition, Ariana had another goal, which she preferred to keep silent about. Namely, the girl wanted to irritate the emperor's son so much that he would demand the dissolution of the engagement. Then the princess smiled and suggested that her assistant Charles become the official winner instead of her, and she would tell him who he should kiss to receive the status. Suddenly, from somewhere in the thicket, a menacing roar was heard. The sound grew louder and gradually turned into a terrifying roar. Ariana's henchman exclaimed in amazement, asking what could be roaring like that, and the girl quietly replied that it could only be a golden boar. The roar grew louder and went off somewhere to the side, and 2 hunters ran out of the thicket after it. Apparently, they had found their prey and were now trying to catch up with it. The Montgomery heiress's eyes widened as she realized that victory could slip away from under her nose, and she commanded her surprised assistant that they should run after him. The boar was really huge, as legends say, and several groups of hunters came running to the noise around it, but no one dared to attack the beast first. When the fictional Sir Thomas and Charles ran out onto the lawn, Ariana's partner literally froze in horror, and the girl reached for the arrow. But seeing that his mistress was about to take a shot, the bodyguard immediately put his hand forward and began to protest that this was not allowed and that it was against the rules. At this time, the golden boar let out another terrifying roar. Apparently, he was tired of standing surrounded by people with swords, and now he was planning to break free. Some hunters tried to hit the beast with bows, but its skin was so thick and hard that the arrows only bounced off without causing any harm to the forest dweller. Ariana looked confused. She had agreed with some of Charles's points and now stood there not knowing what to do. The guy turned around and exclaimed that they should immediately leave the dangerous territory because he could not guarantee the safety of his ward in such conditions. The Montgomery heiress looked into the beast's furious eyes and wondered why they called him golden when he was so dark brown, without a hint of yellow or light tint. The princess raised her bow and noted the fact that she was not going to run from anyone, but preferred to fight. The heiress of the empire, Myrta, smiled and added that now she would show all these hunters how to shoot properly. Taking proper aim, Ariana released the bowstring and the arrow flew towards the golden boar. Unlike other archers, Sir Thomas wanted not just to hit the beast, but to hit it in its most vulnerable place, in the eye. The forest dweller, having received such a serious injury, began to squeal and growl, and then began to rush from side to side, flooding the green grass and foliage around with a thick red color. The princess was delighted that she had managed to hit the target, and Charles became even more alarmed, shouting what they would do if the monster ran towards them. Ariana gave a thumbs up and said that the situation had changed, meaning she now partially agreed with her assistant's statement that they should run away. The next moment, the boar fell to the ground with a crash and tried to get rid of the protruding arrow, but he failed. The other hunters started shouting to each other to shoot at the eyes and even fired a few shots, but no one was able to hit the target. The aristocrats began to discuss what they should do next, but they only walked in circles, afraid to close the distance. Seeing that the hunt had stalled, Ariana took a second arrow from her quiver and began to aim at the boar's remaining healthy eye while mentally scolding the slow-witted nobles for their weakness of spirit. The second arrow whistled towards its target as the princess, in the guise of Sir Thomas, repeated her well-aimed shot. However, at the very moment when the steel tip was ready to pierce the target, a long knight's sword flew in from the other side and from somewhere above. It turned out that the boar was struck in both eyes by arrows and pierced with a blade straight through the head. The other hunters were very surprised by this unexpected circumstance, because they could not even think that their sword could be thrown like an ordinary spear. The beast let out a terrible cry and fell on its side, after which it opened its mouth wide and stuck out its tongue. It was still moving, but life was quickly leaving its huge bestial carcass. Ariana looked at the loot carefully and with surprise, she became very interested in how and where the sword came from in this story. Charles was stunned and asked when his mistress had managed to throw the blade at the boar, to which the princess replied that this was nonsense and the blade did not belong to her. Lady de Cartouche thought that the owner of the weapon must have incredible strength, because it was incredibly difficult to pierce this thick skin, and even the skull, with a flying blade. There was a noise behind her, and Sir Thomas turned around immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. It was the Crown Prince. He patted his adjutant Giron on the shoulder and praised him for a job well done, to which the guy reacted very strangely, as if he did not understand what was happening. Ariana quickly turned away, hoping she would be able to slip away before Cotton arrived, who at that moment continued to loudly admire his assistant's throw. The princess came to the conclusion that the sword must certainly belong to Guido, and also that she needed to get out of there immediately, and she began moving towards the forest. But the next moment the Crown Prince called out to Sir Thomas, and the Montgomery heiress froze in her tracks. Cotton rode his horse straight towards the stranger and began to question him about his family and admire his archery skills. Ariana tensed up because she couldn't name anyone else but de Cartouche, but then it would immediately become clear that she was from the Empire of Karn, and her cunning would be revealed. So the princess decided that the best way out of this situation was to flee as quickly as possible, and she rushed away. Cotton and his adjutant were shocked that the stranger wanted to leave the conversation so easily, and also that he dared to abandon his henchman. Charles asked his master whether he should pursue the fugitive, but the prince replied that he should not do so. And then Guido's face became serious, and he added that he wanted to catch up with this ill-mannered boy who allowed himself such antics. The adjutant wished the owner a successful capture, and saw how the Crown Prince reared his horse and then rushed to catch up with the stranger. The heir to the Empire's assistant decided that he could easily find a suitable occupation for himself and looked towards the slain beast. Meanwhile, the other knights surrounded the boar, which had already given up its ghost, and began to praise the strength and bravery of Sir Giron, for they had heard the Crown Prince himself call him the master of the sword. Ariana ran through the forest, not paying attention to where she was going, and thought about why meetings with Cartoon always brought her nothing but trouble. The princess also remembered her bodyguard and assistant, Sir Charles. She felt a little awkward about leaving him, although she was sure that everything would be fine with him. Suddenly, Lady de Cartouche stopped in her tracks. She suddenly realized that the Crown Prince had taken the victory, which meant that all her plans, which had been so long and carefully built, had collapsed. Ariana became very nervous about the fact that she wanted to hurt the prince's pride, but in the end she herself was damaged. The princess began to look around, trying to understand whether she should run further or whether she was already safe. Finally, the girl decided that she could relax, and thought that she should at least catch someone so as not to return empty-handed, but suddenly the ground under her feet began to collapse. The Montgomery heiress knew she was standing on the edge of a cliff, but she didn't expect it to be so fragile. But the ground suddenly began to crumble, she lost her balance, and fell down. Having fallen from the height, the princess began to roll head over heels down the steep slope. As a result, the girl fell on her back and hit the ground very painfully. Still lying at the foot of the cliff, Ariana looked up in front of her and saw the rising edge of the cliff she had fallen from. The heiress of the Karna Empire opened her eyes wide and was surprised by the fact that she had survived such a great fall. Cotton's horse moved clearly in the direction in which the unknown hunter had fled. Finally, the Crown Prince found himself at the edge of the forest, near the abyss, but the fugitive was nowhere to be seen. Seeing the hare lying on the grass, Guido immediately dismounted and hurried closer to examine the find properly. The heir to the Empire of Myrta was very surprised to find the wig. It turns out that the unknown knight wore it, but for what purpose? Cotton's gaze became very serious, because this could be an enemy spy from whom nothing good could be expected. Suddenly, the prince caught a barely noticeable rustle coming from over the edge of the cliff. In search of the source of the noise, Guido slowly approached the very edge of the abyss and carefully looked down. Cotton was very surprised by what he saw there, because such a denouement of the story of the mysterious shooter could not have occurred to him. There, at the very bottom, sprawled on her back, lay the heiress of the Karna Empire, who looked at the prince with no less surprise. Ariana laughed and shouted that Cartoon was very lucky because she was really happy to see him now. Cotton immediately descended the steep slope of the hill and found himself at the bottom. He ran up to Lady de Cartouche and asked how she came to be there, and if everything was all right with her. Coming closer, Guido stopped and asked the next question. Why is the princess wearing these clothes and what does it all mean? Behind the girl on the ground lay a bow and scattered arrows, which the crown prince noticed. The heir to the Empire of Myrta noted that he now knew exactly who the archer was who had shot the wild beast right in the eye, to which Ariana laughed and admitted her prank. Suddenly, Cotton started shouting at the princess because he was outraged by this prank. Guido accused the Montgomery heiress of needlessly risking her life when the boar could easily kill her, to which the girl smiled and replied that she was in complete control of the situation. But the crown prince did not calm down, but only became even more angry and continued to reproach the princess for the fact that her irresponsible behavior was more reminiscent of a little girl than a noble lady. Cotton then looked at the princess's boot, which looked unnatural, and asked how she felt. In response, Ariana shrugged her shoulders and calmly replied that she might have broken her leg, and from this information, Guido began to shout even louder at the bride, accusing the girl of being crazy. Lady de Cartouche finally became serious and asked him to stop raising his voice at her, and then added that a broken leg was not fatal and would heal after a couple of months in a plaster cast. Cotton covered his face with his hand and remarked that arguing with the princess was a waste of time. The guy then bent down and noted that he should take care of her injury, after which he began to carefully examine and gently feel the area of injury. The crown prince lifted the girl's leg and began to carefully remove her white boot to assess the extent of the damage. After performing some manipulations to bend and rotate the foot, Guido came to the conclusion that the bone was not damaged. Then the heir to the Myrta Empire took out a handkerchief and said that the princess had a muscle strain, which he would now take care of. Ariana asked how Cartoon knew about such things, since he was not a doctor, and the crown prince replied that a knight should be able to properly assess his wounds and then applied a bandage. Guido then extended his hand and invited the girl to stand up, leaning on him to get out of there. The Montgomery heiress looked at the prince in surprise and asked how she could get up and walk if her leg was injured. Cotton thought for a moment and sighed, remembering that every meeting he had with Lady de Cartouche had brought him nothing but trouble. The crown prince turned to the girl and held out his hands so that she could climb onto his back. Guido placed his palms directly on the ground to help the bride up and lift her up, to which the princess remarked that she could try to walk on her own, albeit through pain. To this, the heir to the Empire of Myrta replied that she might be able to move slowly on her own, but it would be extremely difficult for her to overcome the slope on her own 2 feet. Good running start and ran down the steep slope, pushing off and jumping from ledge to ledge. Literally, a few seconds later, the young people were already at the top of the hill, which surprised the girl very much because she did not expect such a high level of physical fitness from the prince. And while the heirs of the empires of Karna and Myrta were moving towards the horse, Ariana began to tease and provoke Cartoon, saying that he had already annoyed everyone with his behavior. Cotton stopped and said that if the princess did not stop talking nonsense, she would immediately find herself on the grass, deprived of the slightest help. After a short silence, Lady de Cartouche asked whether Guido would carry her on his back to the camp or put her on a horse. After wondering if the princess would be able to stay in the saddle, Cotton headed towards his horse, which was waiting patiently near the trees. Cotton lifted Ariana and carefully placed her on the front of his horse's saddle, making sure she didn't slip to the ground. The crown prince himself sat in the back, and then they slowly set off on their return journey. After a few minutes, Guido noticed that the position in which they were riding was causing him some discomfort, but the princess replied that he should be patient. Montgomery's heiress placed her hand on the boy's chest and said that everything suited her and that she was very comfortable. This angered Cotton, and he asked the girl to turn away from him and look forward, in the direction the horse was moving. She did not argue and turned around. For some time the young people rode in silence, looking ahead and each thinking about something of their own. Suddenly Ariana turned her head, looked at the rider and asked why he was always so unhappy, and what was she doing wrong this time? The crown prince said that everything was fine and that he didn't mean anything by it. He was just lost in thought and wanted to remain silent. And as they rode on in silence, Cotton suddenly remembered that Ariana had been very light when he had lifted her into the saddle, much lighter than he had previously imagined. Guido thought it was very strange because he had never cared how much the princess weighed, but now he suddenly felt a slight joy from the memory of her. Then the boy remembered how he bandaged his injured leg and how he wanted to take care of the heiress of the Karna Empire. And while the horse slowly carried the young riders back to the camp, the crown prince reflected on the fact that today he looked at his bride in a new way. The prince and princess were riding under thick trees, and Lady de Cartouche began to talk about how she was very clever and lucky, so that she almost always remained unharmed. Cotton noted that these were very strange words from a man who was forced to ride sideways because he had injured his muscle in an accidental fall off a cliff. But Ariana insisted on her luck, and as an argument she reminded him that the height was simply enormous, and an ordinary person would probably have been killed as a result of such a flight. Then the Montgomery heiress added that the crown prince himself examined her and saw that, apart from a minor leg injury, the girl was completely fine. Lady de Cartouche also drew the rider's attention to the fact that she experienced virtually no physical pain and had the ability to heal her wounds at an incredible speed. Cotton asked why she was telling him all this, to which the princess was surprised and replied that it was all because she was the same as him. After this, Ariana raised her hand and added that, among other things, she possessed incredible strength and was capable of winning a fight with a powerful opponent. After a short pause, the girl shared the secret of such abilities. It turns out that real magic was contained in her heart. The Montgomery heiress recalled the incident in the mansion where she was lured and added that she was being protected by some higher power that was making sure that everything was okay with her. Lady de Cartouche looked into the eyes of the surprised prince and added that she felt the same magic in him, which is why he is such a lucky and powerful warrior. After a brief silence, the crown prince noted that the girl could learn to control her abilities and become an outstanding warrior or sorceress. Ariana thoughtfully replied that she did not consider herself a talented student, and therefore did not think about dedicating her life to any of the paths mentioned by the prince. Cotton recalled that after they met, he read Lady de Cartouche's personal file and that her younger brother was mentioned there. Sitting on her horse, the Montgomery heiress admitted that she really doesn't like to obey and prefers absolute, unlimited freedom, and therefore often creates difficulties for other people. Guido smiled and replied that the princess had no equal in this because each of their meetings was a dangerous adventure. Ariana looked at the guy in surprise. She didn't expect that he perceived their communication in this way. But then, after thinking a little, the princess decided not to argue with this statement because indeed their meetings were filled with extreme events. For some time the couple rode in silence. Suddenly Lady de Cartouche looked at her leg and called out to the crown prince. She asked what he thought about the kiss that would go to the first lady of the hunt. Cotton's face instantly turned dark, and he asked her if she really wanted to receive his kiss, to which the girl immediately became indignant and protested. Ariana clarified that, as far as she understood, the crown prince did not intend to win this hunt, since he gave his sword to his assistant, and Guido agreed with these words. The Montgomery heiress immediately smiled and noted that this was wonderful news, which she liked very much, after which the girl raised her finger up and said that she wanted to ask the prince for one favor. After some time, the winner of the imperial hunting competition arrived at the royal tent, and the sky was still clear with small white clouds. By this time, the crown prince's adjutant had already laid at the feet of His Majesty the Emperor the tail of that very golden boar that dozens of knights had been chasing through the forest. The king looked closely at the trophy lying on the red cushion and asked if this was really the wild beast that was the stuff of legends. Giron answered in the affirmative, and the ruler thoughtfully commented on the gift, noting that, judging by the size of the tail, it was indeed a gigantic boar. Then the emperor continued to question Sir Tyroman about the character and habits of the forest giant, whether he was dangerous and aggressive as described in the legends, and the guy confirmed these words. At the same time, the knight felt remorse because he knew who had actually killed the boar, and it was extremely unpleasant for him to communicate while wearing the mask of a modest winner. But Giron was carrying out the crown prince's orders, who cut off the boar's tail and gave it to the boy, telling him exactly what he should do. What most perplexed the adjutant was Cotton's instruction that he was to select a particular noblewoman as the first lady of the hunt. Giron even tried to resist, but the crown prince pointed his finger at him and said seriously that this was an order that could not be discussed. The adjutant even shed a tear from annoyance, but he could do nothing because he completely obeyed his master and could not disobey him. And now Cotton stood aside and drank tea with an unperturbed look, and his father was sad because he expected that it would be his son who would defeat the boar. After all, now the king's plan to have Guido bring the tail and kiss the princess of the Karna Empire has failed. Moreover, the emperor was also upset by the fact that Lady de Cartouche herself was forced to hastily leave the event due to poor health. Finally resigned to the fact that everything had not gone according to plan, the king announced that the winner, Sir Giron Tyroman, could choose a noblewoman who would receive the title of First Lady of the Hunt. The young knight stood up and looked at the group of young aristocratic women who kept their eyes on the valiant winner. The guy looked at their faces, which said, "Choose me," and understood that this was a really difficult decision because you can only point to one, and everyone else will be upset. However, Tyroman did not have to choose, which made the task somewhat easier since he had a direct order from the crown prince, so the adjutant said that all the ladies were beautiful, but there was only one prize. The winner looked at the girls who were nearby, but did not find the one who was supposed to receive the title of First Lady, so he moved on to where more prestigious persons were sitting at tables. Adilia looked closely at Tormin, who moved towards her. She had been waiting for this moment since the very beginning of the hunt. The thing is, her new friend gave her a magical decoration that was supposed to increase her attractiveness in the eyes of the men around her. The guy said that the winner's name doesn't matter. If she wears this brooch, then any aristocrat will only look at her. Heiress McNagan checked the decoration to make sure it was in place and waited, but seeing that Tyroman was getting closer to her table, Adilia decided to take off the brooch and put it on the table because she didn't need any helpers to win. The noblewoman lowered her eyes, anticipating her imminent triumph because she was sure that no one except the imperial family could compare to the height of her status and physical beauty. And when Giron came even closer, Lady McNagan could not resist and rose from her seat, holding out her hand to meet the expected kiss. However, the crown prince's adjutant walked past without even looking in Adelia's direction and knelt down at the next table. Those around were stunned by this turn of events, and the young aristocrats cried out in amazement in unison. At that moment, the heiress of McNagan was ready to burn with shame, resentment, and annoyance because she thought that everything would be completely different. Tiraman closed his eyes and, kneeling, spoke words in which he extolled the beauty of Lisandre Diaz and declared his desire to give the winner's kiss to her. The girl was so shocked by this event that she couldn't even formulate her answer and only asked if Giron really wanted to kiss her hand. Louisiana, who was sitting next to her, covered her mouth in surprise and whispered that she was very happy for her little sister. The young man, meanwhile, took the lady by the hand and demonstratively kissed her, thereby bestowing upon the Baron's youngest daughter the status of First Lady of the Hunt. Then Tiraman added that all the ladies here were beautiful, but none could compare to Lisandre's beauty. The youngest Diaz heiress stood up unsteadily from her seat, her face flushed with color as she was deeply embarrassed by this turn of events. The astonished young ladies jumped up from their seats, unable to contain their strong emotions. At this, Adilia froze in place and began to grind her teeth in anger and despair. Heiress McNagan turned around and screamed that this couldn't be happening because the First Lady title should belong to her. Tiraman and the Baron's daughter turned towards the girl and looked at her questioningly, and she continued, adding that Giron had no right to choose anyone other than her. Then Adilia screamed that such behavior was a direct insult to her high status, which could only be compared to the imperial family. The Crown Prince's adjutant looked at the enraged aristocrat with a cold and calm gaze that did not express any emotion. Seeing that her words had no effect on the boy, Lady McNagan quickly approached the young knight and swung her sword, demanding that he immediately ask her forgiveness for his actions. Suddenly, everyone heard Cotton order the girl to stop, the voice of the heir to the Myrta Empire sounding firm and loud. The noblewoman immediately shuddered and stopped, frozen in indecision over Giron. Adilia turned around and began to justify herself to the Crown Prince, but he interrupted her and asked what kind of circus she was setting up here. Guido's look was very stern, and he added that no aristocrat had the right to behave in such a way in the presence of the Emperor. The McNagan heiress's eyes suddenly widened as it dawned on her that she had just committed an unforgivable act of impudence. The king turned in his place and looked in bewilderment at the noblewoman, who had put on an emotional performance in front of everyone. Suddenly, Edel decided to go all the way and, pointing her finger at Giron, said that she had been terribly insulted by this unworthy man. Guido remembered his recent conversation with Ariana and thought that the trap they had set for the villain who had attempted to kill the princess had worked brilliantly. It was when they were riding together on a horse through the forest that the Montgomery heiress mentioned the expression on Adelia's face. It was as if there was no more important and prestigious person in the world. The prince and princess came to the conclusion that Lady McNagan was too impulsive to control herself, because this aristocrat does not know how to control herself at all. Cotton thought about it, because such an opportunity didn't come along often, and all the factors were on their side. Guido asked his fiancée what she thought about this, since Adilia was involved in the attempt on her life. Ariana smiled and replied that this was their chance to sort out the situation, since magic was involved. The Crown Prince's thoughts returned from the past to the present and asked what Lady McNagan meant by insult. Adilia pointed at Giron and replied that he was walking towards her, looking at her, but when he came closer and she stood up, he walked past. Cotton raised his white-gloved hand to his face and remarked that this was a very unusual situation that needed to be looked into. Suddenly, from the table where the Diaz sisters were sitting, a dull thud of a fist was heard on the table, and an exclamation saying that this was nonsense. It was Louisiana, and she was furious that her younger relative, the innocent little Lisandre, was being dishonored by this arrogant noblewoman. The day before, a conversation had taken place between the Baron's daughters, in which the eldest asked the younger one for forgiveness for her behavior and said that she was under hypnosis during the attack. The youngest heiress, Diaz, tried to calm her relative and told her that she had visited the princess and that she had forgiven the girl for her actions. Lisandre then suggested that her sister go to the royal hunting competition to thank Ariana for her kindness, but the eldest daughter was very scared by this prospect. Then the Baron's youngest heiress said that she would keep her company, and they would be together at this crucial moment. Louisiana was very grateful to her sister for her support, so she decided to stand up for her. She stood up and raised her hand, saying that she wanted to express her opinion on this matter. Cotton looked at the girl he had seen before in surprise. He didn't expect to meet Lady Diaz at the winner's award ceremony. The girl stood up and straightened up. She put her hand to her chest and introduced herself as the Baron's daughter. Lisandre was surprised and a little scared because she didn't know what exactly her sister was going to say. Louisiana, still holding her hand to her chest, noted that she wanted to become a witness during the investigation into this incident. The Crown Prince thought that the beatings that Ariana had inflicted on the girl must have had an extremely positive effect, and then said out loud that he gave his consent for the witness to participate. Adilia began to protest, arguing that everything was very simple here and no witness testimony was required. The heir to the empire looked menacingly at the noblewoman and replied that the decision had already been made and a third party would take part in the proceedings. Heiress McNagan pressed her lips together and ground her teeth in indignation, but there was nothing she could do. Louisiana pointed towards her younger sister and told how the winner of the competition, who had defeated the Golden Boar, approached the girl, knelt down and gave her a kiss. After this, the Baron's eldest daughter reported that Lady Adilia suddenly began to shout at Sir Giron and say rude words to the young man. The adjutant stood quietly all this time and was a little nervous, although he tried not to show it and just remained silent. Louisiana added that the winner of the competition could not in any way offend the honor of the heiress of the McNagan family, because he was purposefully going to Lisandre Diaz's table. Guido turned his gaze to the young ladies standing nearby and asked if they had anything to add to what had been said, but they remained silent. And then the Crown Prince said that everything was clear to him. Cotton looked at Adilia and asked her if the witness's account was true, and she replied that, in general, it was. Then the Crown Prince moved decisively towards Lady McNagan and in a stern voice asked on what grounds she had allowed herself to insult Sir Tyramin. Suddenly, Louisiana raised her hand high and said loudly that she asked permission to add something to her words. Adilia looked at her former comrade and subordinate with hatred, but thought it would be better to remain silent for now. The Baron's eldest daughter added that she was able to remember word for word everything that Lady McNagan had recently said and could repeat these words at the first request. Cotton barely managed to keep the joyful smile from appearing on his face and replied that the witness could begin, while he himself thought that Louisiana could really be of good help to him and the princess. The older sister came up from the table, cleared her throat, and said that she would be ready in a moment. The next moment, the calm and determined lady changed beyond recognition. She literally turned into a mad Adilia, who was shouting at the Crown Prince's adjutant. After finishing the performance, the girl turned to the young noblewomen who had been watching it all. She asked them if it was like what they had seen before. The aristocrats began to clap and praise the heiress of Diaz for her wonderful performance, which completely repeated the emotions and words of Lady Adilia. Louisiana then played out the second part of the show as McNagan ran up to Sir Giron and swung at him to strike. After this, the Baron's daughter returned the previous smile to her face, and laughing noted that now even those who missed what happened were now fully aware. The Crown Prince approached the adjutant and asked him if he agreed that the replica was similar to the original, and the boy replied that it was an exact copy, which made him just as nervous. Cotton turned to Adilia and noted that, from the evidence of eyewitnesses, the insult had indeed been inflicted, but on Sir Tyramin, not on her. Guido's gaze became very hard and serious. He added that for some unknown reason, Lady McNagan decided to appropriate someone else's prize for herself as soon as she realized that she would not become the First Lady of the hunt. Guido reminded the horrified Adilia that Sir Giron was his adjutant, which meant that both the Crown Prince and the Emperor had been insulted since he had granted Tyramin the right to choose the lady. The aristocrat turned pale and found it difficult to stand on her feet, at which point Cotton turned to his father and asked him to decide what punishment the McNagan heiress should suffer. The ruler of the Myrta Empire was not happy with what the final part of the royal hunt had turned into, but the rules of life for a nobleman were harsh and the same for everyone. Ariana stabbed another portion of fruit from the plate with her fork and asked what punishment the emperor had chosen for the villainess. Cotton, who was sitting on the opposite side of the table, sipped some tea from his cup and replied that the retribution was sending the girl to a convent. The princess was very unhappy with this decision because she had hoped for a more severe punishment. Guido added that for the daughter of Duke McNagan, this is a very serious blow, which will negatively affect the reputation of the entire family, but the status will allow her to return home in a year. Lady Montgomery grimaced, but replied that this result was also quite good, although she had expected more. Then Ariana stood up and asked if the Crown Prince had managed to find out anything about the connection between Adilia and dark magic, but the guy said that he had not felt anything like that. The princess looked at her fingers and thoughtfully said that it was very strange. Perhaps something had gone wrong, or perhaps the villainess had decided not to take risks in the presence of the king. Cotton glanced at his reflection in his teacup and noted that they were not yet finished with their investigation, and so his men would be keeping a close eye on Lady McNagan. Ariana looked at the prince cheerfully and added that identifying and punishing villains was his direct responsibility, since the well-being of the entire Myrta Empire depended on it. Then the Montgomery heiress propped her head on her hand and said that she wanted to know something else from the Crown Prince. The girl reminded Cotton of his adjutant, who took upon himself the burden of the conqueror and gave a kiss to a certain lady. Guido confirmed that Sir Tyraman had been serving him for quite a long time, and then Ariana began asking about the guy, inquiring about his biography and achievements. Cotton put his cup down on the table and looked closely at his bride. Then the heir to the Empire of Myrta asked why Lady de Cartouche was so interested in Giron and why she needed to know so much about this man. Ariana replied that this was very important and useful information for her for one simple reason. Guido repeated his question and said that he wanted to know this reason before he began answering questions about his subordinate. The Montgomery heiress replied that it was elementary, because Sir Tyroman had kissed none other than Lisandre Diaz, who was very close and dear to her. The Crown Prince let out a sigh of relief and said that now everything was clear to him. Ariana added that she wants to know absolutely everything about him, his age, hobbies, biographical facts, and so on. Cotton, however, turned away and remarked that he had no desire to satisfy Lady de Cartouche's curiosity. The Montgomery heiress began to shout at the prince that he was behaving inappropriately, but the next moment there was a knock on the door. The door opened, and a young servant appeared on the threshold. He reminded His Highness that it was time to begin preparing for the banquet, so as to be on time and not be late. Cotton immediately had an image of his father, who was very angry with his son for disrupting the emperor's plans, so as punishment he had to sit at the banquet for an entire day. With a sigh, the Crown Prince stood up and headed towards the door, and the heiress of the Karna Empire smiled and wished him a pleasant time at the tiring event. Guido turned around and looked angrily at Ariana. She still irritated him, maybe even more, although he tried to restrain himself. Suddenly, Cotton smiled widely and invited the princess to join him to have fun together at the upcoming event. The girl smiled cheerfully and replied that she would be happy to share the fun, but her injured leg still hurt and she did not want to interfere with her recovery. The Crown Prince said that he understood everything, but he would be sorry if the princess missed the special part, which was planned for the final part of the banquet and was its highlight. Ariana immediately asked him to tell her about it in more detail, but Cotton replied that the only way to find out the details was to go to the banquet with him and see everything in person. The princess became angry and began to shout at the Crown Prince again, accusing him of openly blackmailing her, which is outrageous behavior for an aristocrat. During the noisy banquet, the guests actively discussed the recent imperial hunt, as well as the events that took place there, in particular Sir Giron's victory and his kiss for the Baron's daughter. Those gathered were interested in whether the winner of the royal competition received the status of Viscount, as well as any details from the life of the First Lady of the hunt, Lisandre. The main star of the evening was indeed Lady Diaz, and young gentlemen literally crowded to attract her attention. For example, Baron Bigel wanted to invite her to dance. But the next moment Sir Mater came up and, sharply pushing the guy with his elbow, invited the girl to a waltz. The young men with outstretched hands practically surrounded the First Lady of the hunt, which made her feel uneasy because they frightened her with their persistence. Unable to withstand the emotional onslaught, Lisandre blushed, apologized, and ran across the hall to her relative to ask for help and protection. Louisiana was standing near a table with delicious snacks on it. She was standing next to it, eating the treats and laughing at the random gentleman who mistook her for his younger sister. The older sister looked at her relative in surprise and raised her finger to her face, and then began to discuss the topic of how this status of First Lady had brought a lot of trouble and problems into their lives. Finally, the Baron's daughter suggested that her relative faint in order to somehow defuse the tense situation. Louisiana also suggested that the younger sister should pretend to have sprained her ankle and use that as an excuse to leave the event. And while the Baron's daughters were deciding what they should do to get rid of their suitors, someone suddenly grabbed Lisandre by the hand. Lady Diaz turned and looked in surprise at the young blonde guy who began to reproach her for just walking around the room. The stranger raised his voice and accused the Baron's youngest daughter of daring to refuse him, the heir of Count Dobrin, a representative of a noble family. Louisiana looked closely at the guy. She had heard only bad things about Count Dobrin's youngest son, and now she was personally convinced of his nasty and arrogant character. The young impudent fellow continued to be rude and insolent, and then even began to threaten the girl with trouble, but suddenly he was called out from behind. The Count's heir turned around with displeasure and looked at the man who dared to distract his attention. Sir Dobrin was very surprised to see two Diaz daughters standing in front of him, very similar to each other. Louisiana demanded that the nobleman immediately stop such provocative behavior and leave her sister alone, because if she does not want to dance with him, then he has no right to force her. The Count's son was outraged that someone dared to contradict him, but the elder Diaz only took a deep breath to rebuff the ill-mannered man. A few seconds before, Cotton had been standing bored in the corner of the room, playing with a glass in his hand and watching the wine splash in a clear container. The Crown Prince dreamed of only one thing, for the celebration to end as quickly as possible. Suddenly a sharp cry made Guido flinch so violently that he even spilled wine on the floor. The heir to the empire, Myrta, immediately went to see what was going on and saw Louisiana yelling at Count Dobrin's son, accusing him of harassing his sister. Having assessed the situation, the Crown Prince came to the conclusion that the Baron's daughters were in some kind of trouble. Cotton pointed in the direction of Lady Diaz and told the adjutant that he should look into the matter because he was the one who gave the First Lady of the Hunt the kiss and therefore was responsible for it. Giron was clearly unhappy with this order because he did not choose the lady himself, but only carried out the prince's order, but there were no options, and the guy went to carry out the new order. Guido watched his assistant go and thought it was very convenient when he could delegate unpleasant work to someone else. The conflict only escalated all this time. The young people shouted at each other, swore and accused each other of inappropriate behavior. Suddenly, Lisandre noticed Sir Tiraman making his way through the crowd towards them. He moved slowly but persistently, and there was a smile on his face. The Baron's youngest daughter greeted Viscount Giron in a breaking voice, to which he replied that she could simply call him Sir. The Count's son was so engrossed in his argument with Louisiana that he didn't notice a young man approaching him. All this time, Dobrin continued to squeeze Lisandre's wrist with force, which caused her physical pain and was extremely unpleasant psychologically. Suddenly, someone's strong hand grabbed the Count's youngest son in the same way he had held the Baron's daughter. The young nobleman, surprised, immediately loosened his grip, and the girl managed to escape. Continuing to firmly squeeze and twist Count Dobrin's wrist, Tiraman smiled politely and greeted his offender. Sir Giron then politely remarked that the aristocrat was being too loud and was attracting too much attention. After this, the Crown Prince's adjutant pointed to the door and calmly said that if the Count wanted to challenge him to a duel, he could proceed outside, but making a scene in the palace was forbidden. Hearing about a possible real fight with the Emperor's knight, Dobrin immediately turned pale and replied that he was already leaving. Sir Tiraman then turned to the Diaz sisters and asked if they were all right. Lisandre immediately put her hands to her chest and assured Giron that they were fine. The girl was very grateful to the Crown Prince's adjutant for the help he gave her because she did not know how to get out of this situation on her own. At this time, at the other end of the banquet hall, 3 young aristocrats were discussing the absence of Lady Adilia, who had never missed such events before. One of the girls said that the heiress of McNagan had angered the king himself, for which she had been punished, and was now under surveillance far from here. After chatting for a while, the noblewomen came to the conclusion that the absence of such an emotional person would be beneficial to any banquet, and then they laughed. These words were heard by a young girl standing behind the column. She was very upset by such news. The McNagan mansion was in chaos, dishes were flying around the room, glass was falling on the floor, and furniture was broken. The young noblewoman smashed everything she could reach in her path while shouting various curses. In the heat of anger, Adilia didn't even notice how a young guy approached her and quietly called the girl by name. Finally, she froze in helplessness, and then heard the aristocrat quietly ask her why she had taken off the magic brooch, since it was her guarantee of victory and the status of First Lady of the Hunt. Instead of answering, the McNagan heiress threw a pillow at the boy but missed, and then screamed at him to shut up immediately. Adilia hissed furiously that she didn't need any magic because she had no equal except for the royal family, so she was the most worthy candidate. The noblewoman added that she was the only daughter of a duke, and therefore only the imperial family was above her, and everyone else must obey her. This idea was instilled in the girl many years ago by her dying mother, who blessed the baby to be the most important lady in the empire, not counting the king's relatives. But Adilia was not alone. With her was her sister, who always remained in the shadow of her older relative. Few people spoke about her and rarely remembered her. The girl leaned on the table and loudly said that she was actually more worthy of the title of First Lady of the Hunt, because she was better by birthright. And then she added that everyone should have seen confirmation of her high status, but instead, something incredibly terrible and horrible happened. The nobleman stood in the doorway and silently watched as Adel suffered from her failure. To some extent he was disappointed, as he expected more from her. The guy felt sorry, but not for the McNagan heiress, but for his plan, into which he had put so much effort, and now was forced to fail because of this arrogant person who had ruined his plan. The villain thought about how he could use the girl now, because she was so emotional and reckless that she was simply useless, and maybe even dangerous. Then the guy decided to make one last attempt and try to extract at least some benefit from Adel, because he had already spent quite a lot of time on her. The stranger looked at the brooch, imbued with magical power, and thought that this test would be the last check for the McNagan heiress, and if she failed it, she would be punished. The next day after the banquet, when Ariana woke up and got herself ready, she immediately went to the crown prince's chambers to ask him one question that was bothering her. The princess literally burst into the air to the Myrta Empire, throwing open the doors with a sharp movement and starting to reproach Cotton from the threshold for not telling her everything about the end of the banquet. The girl wanted to know what was so important and special that was supposed to happen at the very end of the celebration, but she froze in place, suddenly seeing the queen sitting on the sofa. The empress looked up from her tea and looked at the Montgomery heiress with some surprise, since her haste and rudeness clearly did not correspond to the image of a decent lady. Ariana was shocked that the crown prince's mother witnessed her emotional act, as she had put a lot of effort into building her own reputation. Quickly coming to her senses, the princess immediately modestly lowered her eyes, respectfully curtsied, and began to apologize to the woman for her unworthy behavior. The Queen Mother replied that the heir to the Karna Empire had no need to apologize, since she herself had come to her son's chambers uninvited while he was away. Then the Empress smiled and invited the girl to join her, since they had never spoken face to face during all this time, but only greeted and said goodbye. Ariana bowed politely and replied that it was a great honor for her to be so close to the Crown Prince's parents, and she gladly accepted the invitation. The maid immediately brought another cup and placed it in front of the Montgomery heiress, after which she promptly filled it with aromatic tea. The queen reminded the princess that she had injured her leg during the hunting tournament and asked how she was feeling, since she had even left the event before it was over. Lady de Cartouche thanked him for his concern and replied that she was recovering quickly, but that the injury was still making itself felt. The Empress replied that she was very happy about this news, and then asked what brought her to her son's chambers, and what important thing she wanted to ask the Crown Prince about the banquet that had just taken place. Ariana said that Guido had intrigued her by telling her that something fun and unusual would happen at the end of the celebration, so she wanted to know what exactly he was talking about. The queen smiled and noted that Cotton must have been referring to the hunter's treasure quest, as it always accompanied the banquet at this time of year. The heiress of the Karna Empire opened her mouth in surprise and asked again what this meant, because this was the first time she had heard about it. The woman took another sip of tea and then told him that there was a legend according to which an incredible treasure was hidden somewhere near the castle, or maybe even inside it. According to legend, the unique artifact belonged to the first concubine of the king of the Murta Empire, but before her death she managed to hide it, and until now no one has found it, although many have tried. According to the rules, only members of the imperial family are allowed to conduct the search, but since Lady de Cartouche is Cotton's fiancée, she can also join the treasure hunt. The queen then asked if Ariana would like to join the search, but the princess did not answer immediately, but thought about it because she did not intend to be part of their family and was making plans to dissolve the union. Without waiting for an answer, Guido's mother noted that the treasure was a rare artifact, and whoever found it would be able to fulfill his most cherished wish, but only one. The Montgomery heiress even rose in her chair from this news. She had no idea that such incredible objects existed that were capable of such a thing. However, the Empress added that it is not the artifact itself that grants the wish, but the imperial family that grants the hunter one wish if he finds the hidden treasure. Ariana was shocked by this news and immediately thought that this would solve all her problems because she could wish for a divorce and become free as before. Then the girl stood up, put her hand to her chest, and said that she wanted to take part in the search for the treasure, after which the Empress wished the girl success. After this, the Montgomery heiress thanked the queen for a pleasant and useful conversation, and then excused herself and walked out the door, because a plan of action had already begun to appear in her head. The woman remained, accompanied by her maid, drinking tea and reflecting on this unexpected meeting, from which she learned a lot about her son's future wife. Cotton's mother looked out the window and thought that the treasure had not belonged to anyone for too long. Perhaps right now the artifact would find a new owner. The princess walked quickly down the corridor and scolded the crown prince for not telling her all the details about the end of the banquet. The girl was also sure that the guy deliberately hid such important information from her. Rin ran after her and was very worried about her mistress's leg, since she had only recently recovered from an injury. Ariana stopped, lifted the hem of her dress and showed the maid her leg, adding that the swelling had gone down, which meant she was fine and there was nothing to worry about. The Montgomery heiress laughed and remarked that she could even run, to which the maid immediately jumped up to her mistress and declared that she would not allow herself to be risked like that. Lady de Cartouche stopped and looked around, and even at the ceiling, she was thinking out loud where the treasure could be hidden. Rin noted that it might be some kind of useless trinket, but Ariana replied that firstly, the search itself was interesting, and secondly, the Empress promised to fulfill her wish. The princess noted that they needed to focus on finding clues, so they went to look for local servants who might be able to tell them something. Having met the first servant she came across, who was in the yard near the bushes with wide leaves, Ariana called the girl to her. The Montgomery heiress asked where in the palace the chambers of the emperor's first concubine were located. The maid was not surprised by the question, but merely assumed that the princess was taking part in a treasure hunt and added that she would immediately take the lady to the right place. After some time, they found themselves at the high doors of an unknown room, but they were not locked. The chambers were small but cozy, with a few chairs, a table, a mirror, and other ordinary objects. A large, wide bed with a bedside table and a candlestick next to it. The maid led the visitors into the room and said that since the first concubine had passed away, no one had touched anything in her chambers. Ariana asked about the flowers. Had no one really watered them all this time? To this, the maid replied that there was no need, since the concubine never kept flowers in her room. The Montgomery heiress thoughtfully raised her finger to her lips, and Rin smiled and told the hostess that they were like real detectives now. But Ariana replied in disappointment that in order to follow the trail, evidence was needed, and she didn't even know where to start, because there was nothing here. After looking around the room again, the princess came to the conclusion that the concubine was a modest woman who did not like luxury. Then Lady de Cartouche tried to imagine the image of this man, and thought that, having poor health, she probably did not go anywhere much but sat in the palace all the time. Ariana turned to the maid and asked if there was a place in the castle where the concubine went most often. The maid raised her finger and noted that she was most often seen in the imperial library. Then the Montgomery heiress thoughtfully touched her chin and said that nothing was clear yet, but at least there was some kind of clue. After this, Ariana turned to Rin and said that there was nothing more for them to do here, and then ordered her to follow her, and the girls left the room. As she approached the library, the princess literally screamed because Cotton was standing right in front of the doors. The aristocrat pounced on the guy with questions about what he was doing there, and Guido answered in bewilderment that people go to the library to read books. In turn, the crown prince asked what Ariana was doing here, and the girl directly stated that she had come here in search of treasure. When the guy heard about this, he was very surprised and said that it was very unexpected. He then covered his face with his hand and said that it didn't matter, anyway he was glad to see that her leg was completely healed. To which the Montgomery heiress lifted her dress and showed that the swelling had not yet completely gone down. Then the guy noted that you have to be crazy to run around the corridors with an unhealed injury. Then the princess began to shout at Guido that it was all his fault, since he didn't tell her right away that there was a treasure. The crown prince put his hand to his chest and replied that he only wanted to intrigue the girl so as not to be bored alone at the banquet, and then asked how she even knew about this legend. Ariana was furious when she learned that they wanted to use her to relieve boredom, but she still replied that his mother told her about the treasure, while Rin tried to somehow calm the owner. Then the princess turned around and kicked the door with all her might with her sore leg, causing it to open with a bang. Cotton closed his eyes and shook his head from side to side, expressing his disagreement with this behavior. After waiting a little, the crown prince followed Lady de Cartouche into the imperial library. Seeing Guido following behind, Ariana asked what he was doing there, and the guy replied that, as a member of the imperial family, he was taking part in the treasure hunt. The girl replied that he was late because she had already found the trail, but he could be her assistant. Cotton stopped and asked if the princess really expected to win this hunt. The Montgomery heiress moved further into the room, and the crown prince followed, while the girl noted that since he had not been able to find the artifact in 10 years, it was her turn. Guido replied that this was not the case, he simply had not taken part in the search before, to which Ariana responded by calling his words a banal excuse for his own failure. The spacious and bright library room was full of all kinds of books. Ariana began to look through the shelves and asked Cotton why he thought the concubine came here so often. Without waiting for an answer, the princess asked a new question about how one could find out what exactly the woman was reading. The crown prince replied that their library was very well organized, and therefore the librarian should keep records of these visits. Montgomery's heiress noted that Cotton should immediately find this man and ask him to find all the information about what the concubine had read. When the boy asked why he should do this for her, the princess replied that her leg now hurts, and she cannot walk. As proof, Ariana leaned against a nearby table, and Cotton noted that it was all due to her excessive curiosity. To which the girl replied that this was not so, because the reward was the fulfillment of any wish by the empress herself. Guido thought that this was a very strange reward, which he had never heard of before, but he only asked out loud what she wanted to wish for herself. Lady de Cartouche laughed and replied that it was a very simple wish, and Cotton could have guessed it himself. After all, she will ask the queen to dissolve their union. After these words, the crown prince's face changed and he froze in place. The princess continued to laugh and talk about how much she wanted to break off their engagement. However, judging by the expression on the face of the heir to the Myrta Empire, he did not at all share the feelings and desires that the princess spoke of. For some time, the crown prince stood silently and did not move from his place. Then he turned and walked away, remarking that if this was his bride's sincere wish, then he had a wish of his own to make to the queen mother. Ariana asked him what he wanted to wish for, and the guy, without turning around, answered that he wanted to erase the princess from his life. Lady de Cartouche looked after the crown prince and said that he sometimes behaved very strangely. The princess raised her head up and looked at the ceiling. She noticed that everything around was made of wood or included wood panels, and also had a characteristic woody aroma. Ariana noticed that even the decorative ornaments on the shelves were carved from wood, making it a true paradise for a wood lover. Suddenly, the Montgomery heiress turned her gaze to her assistant, who looked very sad. The princess asked Rin what happened and why she suddenly became sad, when just a few minutes ago she was smiling and happy about the investigation. The maid answered the question with a question. Does her mistress really dislike the heir to the Myrta Empire that much? Ariana said that this was not the case and asked again why the maid had come to such a conclusion. Did the crown prince really irritate her too? Rin thought for a moment. She remembered how Guido saved the lady from the bandits and helped her get to the camp when the lady injured her leg, but the rest of the time they were arguing, and it was strange. Suddenly the maid smiled as if she had understood something and said that she should return to her usual business. This statement surprised Ariana very much, and she immediately pounced on the maid, noting that if they started looking for the artifact, they should finish this business together. But Rin was persistent and said that His Highness was an excellent assistant, and together they would cope faster, and she herself thought that she just needed to leave her mistress alone with the prince more often. Then the maid bowed politely and hurriedly left the library room. When the door closed behind the maid, Ariana suddenly came to her senses and began to reason out loud that she could not believe that Rin had just left her. A thought flashed through the princess's mind that maybe the girl had decided to go and bring her mistress some food, but then Guido came up and asked if everything was okay and who she was talking to. The Montgomery heiress replied that the maid was uncomfortable in the company of the crown prince and left. Cotton looked upset and noticed that if he walked away for a minute, she would start accusing him of something. Ariana suggested that it was his high status that made other people feel uncomfortable. The crown prince paused, then said that he had information regarding the books that the concubine had taken, but there were very few records. Montgomery's heiress was surprised and asked how this could be, since the woman spent quite a lot of time here. Cotton noted that the imperial librarian's notes were so sparse because she rarely borrowed books. Ariana then asked if there were any notes on how often the concubine visited the library in general, and Guido replied that there were notes and in large numbers. The crown prince also added that there are no details about the visits, since the old librarian had moved away long ago, and the new one was not familiar with the concubine. It turns out that she came often, but not for books. Lady de Cartouche drew Cotton's attention to the chair standing near the table. She asked the prince if it could have stood here during the time of the dead woman 10 years ago. The guy replied that this library was built 15 years ago, and since then no one has changed anything here. Montgomery's heiress said she felt something, but couldn't explain what it was yet. Leaning her hand on the wooden tabletop, Ariana noted that the smell of wood was still clearly noticeable, which meant that it was even stronger in the first years after construction. Guido folded his arms and said that there was logic in what she said, but he didn't see how it would help them move forward in their search. Suddenly, the princess opened her eyes wide and raised her finger up. She cried out that now she understood everything, that the concubine did not like to read, but came here to inhale the woody aroma. Cotton replied that this was a perfectly valid statement, and then asked how this information would help them in finding the hidden treasure. Ariana said that it was very simple because they had been looking inside the building before, but they needed to look outside. Then Lady de Cartouche went further into the room and added that since her leg was injured, she would need help. Guido replied that he did not understand her train of thought, but was ready to help if necessary. The Montgomery heiress walked confidently past the bookcases and approached the doors that led to the garden. The crown prince looked after her and asked why they were going into the garden, and Ariana replied that there were many flowers there. After this, the princess revealed that the concubine did not really like flowers, because the maid said that there were never any in her room. Cotton stopped and began to think out loud that if you don't like flowers and prefer trees, then you don't have to plant them outside. There are seedlings that grow well in pots and don't take up much space. Ariana confirmed that the crown prince was thinking in the right direction, but had not yet made the right conclusion. Guido admitted that he still did not understand what Lady de Cartouche was getting at. Then the Montgomery heiress turned around and said that they did not need a simple garden, but one where there were no flowers, but only trees, and asked the crown prince to take her there. As they walked, the princess asked Cotton to tell her about the concubine herself and how the search for the treasure began and when exactly she hid it. The crown prince revealed that the queen and the first concubine were friends and that the artifact had, in fact, been hidden by his mother as a fulfillment of her dying friend's last will. Ariana was very surprised by this information and said that this was very important information. Guido added that the concubine herself was a princess from a kingdom with which the Myrta Empire had diplomatic relations, but she came to them after his parents were married. The young people approached the fence of the park, and the Montgomery heiress asked how old the girl was then, and Cotton answered that she was about 17. They then entered a birch grove, and the heiress of the Karna Empire asked how it came about that the princess became a concubine, to which the crown prince replied that he did not know the details. Ariana suggested that in order to strengthen relations between the countries, the rulers wanted a child to be born from the new union. But Guido noted that by that time he himself had already been born, which meant that a new heir from a concubine would have much less weight and significance in noble circles. The crown prince added that this child would take his place at the very end of the long line to the throne. Ariana grabbed her chin and thought, because if it wasn't about her son, then what was the reason why the young girl was essentially given into slavery? The Montgomery heiress added that this was doubly strange because the kingdom of Myrtle had no need of a slave concubine, since Cotton's father had been a faithful and decent husband. This whole story was covered in a fog of uncertainty and mystery, so the princess even stopped, lost in thought. Suddenly, Ariana's eyes widened and she declared that she was very close to solving the mystery. The princess came closer to Guido and quietly said that the presence of a strange girl in the status of a concubine could ruin his father's marriage. Cotton did not answer, but continued to listen attentively to his companion. Lady de Cartouche's face changed, and she added that most likely the slave had someone she loved but could not be with. Ariana literally shouted that now everything was falling into place because the concubine went to the library to smell the tree, which reminded her of her love. The crown prince stood in some confusion. He saw that the girl was on the trail, but he still could not follow the train of her thoughts. Montgomery's heiress added that she now understood why the empress and concubine were friends, because she did not pose a threat to her marriage, since she herself was deeply in love with someone. Ariana even stamped her foot in joy, and Cotton noticed with concern that she was forgetting that this leg was sore. But the princess did not listen to him, and continued to reason that the lover had to be a man who was always nearby, because she was often sick and did not go anywhere. Guido thought for a moment and replied that this was actually a very small circle of people. It suddenly occurred to Cotton that this could be her personal knight bodyguard, who had been assigned to her as soon as she received official status in the Empire. Ariana noted that in that case the guy should have smelled like wood, but how is that possible? He's not a carpenter. But the crown prince replied that now it seemed to him that she was on the right track, and he thought deeply. Suddenly the boy's eyes widened, and he exclaimed that he was one step closer to solving the mystery. Cotton said that an important element of a knight's swearing in is a tree, and Ariana joked that she didn't understand what that was supposed to look like and suggested that knights rub against trees. Guido made a scary face and grimaced, noting that such fantasies had nothing to do with reality. The crown prince said that according to ancient tradition, each family makes special decorations for its knights, which are carved from wood. Cotton then added that the technology used to make the knight's relic from wood actually allows the scent to be retained. Ariana crossed her arms over her chest and concluded that the concubine's lover was the knight who wore this decoration, exuding a woody aroma. The princess added that the unfortunate concubine could really fall in love with her bodyguard and asked what kind of wood is usually used to create such an ornament. The crown prince leaned slightly towards Lady de Cartouche and replied that the traditional material was birch. Ariana replied that then everything fits together, and they came to the right place, since there were no flowers here and there were plenty of suitable trees. Cotton asked what they must do now to find the treasure. Instead of answering, the Montgomery heiress smiled mysteriously, as her mind finally formed a plan for further action. And then the princess pointed her finger at the ground beneath their feet and declared that he had promised to help her, which meant he should start digging immediately, here and now.